Welcome to the topic of not knowing. This is a very core topic, as you can probably tell. We're talking about epistemology here. We're going to get into some deep stuff. I've really been wanting to talk about this topic now for years, but it's a tricky topic. And it took me a long time to gather my thoughts on this topic and to experiment with it a lot. And finally, I feel ready to talk about it. So let's go. Not knowing. There's a lot to say about not knowing, believe it or not. The biggest obstacle to spirituality is everything you think you know about reality, self, and other. Notice something interesting, something counterintuitive about life, that the most ignorant people think they know everything. And the wisest people are painfully aware of the limits of their knowledge. I have an episode that I released in the past called What is Wisdom, where we compared and contrasted wisdom versus foolishness. And this is one of the ways that you distinguish the wise from the foolish, is how aware are they of the limits of their knowledge? Most people do not consider the limits of knowledge very seriously, and they take it for granted. They take for granted the very possibility of knowing itself, as though knowing that it's even possible is just a given. That's just like how the universe is constructed. It's constructed in a way where we can just look at objects, think about life, and come to know it. But that possibility itself must be questioned, which is what we're going to do today. I'd like you to consider the possibility that you actually don't know what anything is. It's so difficult to get the mind to consider this because the mind thinks that it actually knows what it knows. You actually think that you know things, what they are, but you don't. And so here's where you're going to have to do some work. Really think about this. And if you do this correctly, it should start to disturb you, seriously disturb you. What is anything at all? For example, what is a fork? Here it is. Now, your mind is going to tell you that you know what this thing is. It's a fork. I mean, how hard could it be? But what is a fork? See, that's the problem. And notice that your mind is going to start to come up with stuff. It's like, oh, well, it's an object that you use to poke at stuff, put it in your mouth. It's a food utensil. It's a metal object, or it's a wooden object. It's got a certain shape to it and all that. But as soon as you start to go deeper into that and you start to analyze all of those sub-definitions, because basically what you're doing is you're taking fork and then you're subdividing fork and you're redefining fork in terms of instrument or metal object or food utensil or, metal or wood or it's made of atoms, whatever you think it is. You're going to have to sort of like break it down into more atomic elements, and then you start to have to, of course, ask yourself, well, what are those things, right? We're going to get a lot deeper into this topic. Just like for now, if you can do this, like take a fork, sit there and look at it and sort of do a compare and contrast, like put yourself into a knowing mode and into a not knowing mode. In the knowing mode, that's your normal mode. It's like, oh, it's a fork. Okay, that's easy. We all do that all the time, every day. But then try to shift your mind into the not knowing mode where you're sitting there with this fork and you're looking at it so deeply and so from scratch, as it were, that you actually stop knowing what it is. You see it, it's before you, but you lose connection to all the conceptual baggage of what your mind tells you that it is. And then just sit there sort of in the unknowing of the fork. We'll practice this some more as we keep going, but just let's begin there. So actually what I want to convince you of is that you actually do not know what a fork is. And in fact, there's not a single scientist in the entire world that knows what a fork is, that can tell you what a fork is. That's pretty outrageous if you open your mind to this possibility. Now, one option is that you don't open your mind to this possibility and you deny it and you say, well, Leo, you're just being dumb or you're just being overly philosophical here, and that actually we do know what a fork is. You could take that option. Or the second option is you can actually realize that something profound is being pointed at here, and that maybe actually it is the case that no scientist on this planet knows what a fork is. Now, if you open your mind to that possibility, that's very interesting, because then you have to wonder, like, why is that? Why is it so difficult? Fundamentally, what is it about a fork that makes it so difficult to know? Is it a fork? Like, am I saying that nobody knows what a fork is, but people know what a knife or a spoon is? Is that the claim? Obviously not. So there's nothing special about a fork that makes it so difficult to understand relative to any other object. So this raises some interesting doubts in your mind about the very possibility of knowing what anything is. And then you have to wonder, like, well, do we not know what a fork is simply because it's impossible to know what a fork is? Or do we not know what a fork is because maybe we haven't figured it out yet? We got to try hard. Like, what do we got to do? Do we have to do more science on it? Do we have to, like, look at it under a microscope to figure out what it is? Is it possible to know what a fork is? You should wonder that. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. See, you yourself don't really know that yet because you've never thought about it. And then you got to wonder, if it is possible, how is it possible? What needs to be done to know what a fork is? And why hasn't it already been done? Why is it so difficult to do? Or if it's not possible, then you got to wonder, why is it not possible? Why can't such a simple thing as a fork be known? And then you got to wonder, if that's the case, what does that mean for everything else that I think I know about the world? Because there's a lot of stuff more complex than a fork that you have convinced yourself that you know. So what would it mean for you to realize that you don't actually know those things that you think you know? Now, of course, you don't know what a fork is. You don't know what matter is. You don't know what energy is. You don't know what space is. You don't know what time is. You don't know what an atom is. You don't know what red is. You don't know what sound is. You don't know what a man or a woman is. You don't know what an orgasm is. You don't know what language is. You don't know what life is. You don't know what death is. You don't know what intelligence is. You don't know what consciousness is. You don't know what love is. You don't know what meditation is. You don't know what truth is. You don't know what society is, what beauty is, what happiness is, what science is, what spirituality is, what good and bad is, what light is, what mathematics is, what sentience is, what other is, what reality is, what understanding is. And you don't even know what knowledge is. In an interesting epistemic strange loop. You don't even know that much. In fact, trying to figure out what knowledge is has been the core puzzle that has racked philosophers' minds and led to many controversial debates, very complex, advanced debates within Western intellectual tradition since the dawn of Western philosophy back during, the time of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and all the way through up till today, through modernism, postmodernism, and now postmodernism, and still philosophers are disagreeing about what knowledge is and how to define it. So obviously, if you have an ounce of humility and wisdom, you should recognize that there's something very tricky going on here with knowledge. As a society and as a culture, we treat all the things I listed above as known. Like, when you start school, nobody tells you that mankind doesn't know what any of the above things are. Nobody tells you, like, hey, kid, We don't know what space is. We don't know what time is. We don't know what energy is. We don't know what matter is. We don't even know what a fork is that you're using to eat your food with. So we treat these things as known, and very quickly as you're growing up, you get introduced to this social house of cards that we've constructed. And then you play in this house of cards and you start to mistake this house of cards for reality and for objective truth. And this leads to all sorts of subtle problems that you don't recognize because you're so enmeshed and engrossed in this house of cards, this conceptual house of cards of knowing, that you don't even know what you're missing or what the alternative could be. And you get very attached to this house of cards and you start to defend it too. So here's the core idea of this episode. Most of your knowledge is constructed. It's a highly constructed, highly biased, highly partial conceptual illusion designed to maintain your survival and sense of sanity and comfort. It's not really grounded in a deep truth. Survival, sanity, comfort, not truth. Those are easily confused by society. You are not aware of how relative and biased your knowledge is and how quickly it can collapse under the right questioning, prodding, altered states of consciousness, and so on. Your life is a conceptual fortress that is actually a house of cards, which is actually why you and others, if you haven't noticed yet, act so defensively in debates, arguments, on online forums, on Twitter, in social media comments. People get very ideologically defensive, politically, religiously, even within science, even amongst mathematicians and logicians. If you notice, even amongst the greatest intellectuals and academics and the greatest philosophers, they all disagree with each other and they all get very defensive about their intellectual positions. Why is that? You should start to suspect that something sneaky and mischievous is going on, some sleight of hand. Why this defensiveness, you might wonder? If you're so convinced of the truth of your conceptual fortress, why are you so defensive? Why are you so easily triggered? Why do you feel the need to lash out, to criticize others, to try to debunk others, undermine others, threaten others? Why do you get your fifis hurt so badly in intellectual disputes? Why even have intellectual disputes if you are in possession of the truth? If you already know what you think you know? Or maybe you suspect somewhere deep down in your subconscious mind, you suspect that actually you are living in a conceptual fortress, which is a house of cards, which can easily collapse. And that is in fact why you have to be so defensive about it. Because if you're not defensive, then the wind will just blow your fortress down. And then how are you going to survive? How are you going to maintain your sanity? And how are you going to maintain your comfort in life? See? Notice that these three are what you really want, what most people really want, as opposed to truth. And when there happens to be a rift that opens up between survival, sense of sanity and comfort versus truth, you're going to be very hard pressed to stick with truth. Most people are going to side with survival, sanity, and comfort. So what I'm trying to get you to understand is that you're fooling yourself about how much you know. You think you know a lot, but most of the stuff you know is very partial, very biased, and downright wrong. And from this actually stem most of your problems in life. The only problem here is, though, is that this is such a deep problem that when the actual problems in your life manifest, they don't manifest with a warning label that says, oh, this problem, like, oh, you got divorced, or, oh, your girlfriend cheated on you, or it's like, oh, you're having money problems, or it's like, oh, you can't maintain a job, or it's like, oh, you're depressed and suicidal. See, these issues, when they come up in your life, like, oh, you're obese, or you can't get your ass to the gym on a regular basis, like, these sorts of problems, they don't come with the label of like, your whole understanding of reality is wrong. They aren't disclosed that way. So you think that the problem is something, usually you think the problem is something external. It's like, oh, it's somebody out there. It's that person, she cheated on me. It's her fault. That's why it's happening. I'm depressed because those politicians are, destroying our country. And, I'm struggling with money because of the capitalist system we're in. It's this kind of stuff. Usually you're blaming it on some sort of shallow external force that is impinging upon you and your happiness. But really, you got to look deeper, and you'll see that it's actually because you're fooling yourself about the stuff you think you know. And it's very difficult to get the mind to release its grip on the stuff it thinks it knows but doesn't actually know, or it has a very partial, twisted, corrupted form of knowing of. And it's to see, knowing something isn't just a binary, like you either know it or you don't know it. There's many degrees of knowing a thing. And so one of the tricks the mind uses is like, well, I know a little bit about the fork, and then you kind of like your mind says, well, if I know a little bit about it, it's as though I know the whole thing. It's like, no, you don't know the whole thing. Maybe you know 1% of it. And even that 1% is very wrong in many cases. So what I want you to start to notice is that the mind, not just your mind, but anyone's mind, puts up fake fronts of knowing. Beliefs, assumptions, speculations, theories, hearsay, deductions, narratives, ideology, guesses, intuitions. But all of these are highly fallible and also highly partial. Also, they are twisted to fit the needs of your ego, which is the thing that is looking at the world, right? The ego is not looking at the world objectively. The ego has a very strong slant towards survival and towards meeting its own needs, and so it tends to see the world in whichever way meets those needs. And so here, sort of the fundamental question you have to ask yourself as you're trying to figure out life is, do you care more about the truth or about being right? Because see, most people would rather be right than go seeking the truth. Because to seek the truth, you have to admit that you're wrong. Why? Well, because nobody starts life with the truth. Why? Well, because the society that we're raised into, we get programmed with social conditioning immediately upon birth by parents, siblings, and then as we go to kindergarten, preschool, high school, all this kind of stuff, college, right? Your first 20 years of your life, you're not even thinking about truth for the most part. You're just programmed. You're programmed 24/7. And the stuff you're being programmed with is, of course, the stuff that works for the survival of the society. Again, you can't assume that that is going to be aligned with truth. So if you want to be a serious truth seeker and you fancy yourself as such, then you better cultivate a habit of admitting the basic truth that you don't know a thing when in fact you don't know it. This is just like very fundamental. It's so fundamental that you would kind of like want to skip over this step. But that is the trick. That is the trap. Society creates an illusion of knowing. Religion, science, history, school, professors, books, pundits, experts, leaders, philosophers, public intellectuals, bosses, businesses, politicians, documentaries that you watch, Wikipedia that you search and look through, Google searches, all of this creates what I've referred to in the past as the social matrix. Go check out my episode, The Social Matrix, which dovetails nicely with this one. But all of this creates an illusion like mankind knows more than we do. The depth of mankind's ignorance is never acknowledged by mankind. This is the fundamental epistemic folly of mankind. And we have no one to call us out on our bullshit because there's no other advanced species on this planet that we can communicate with. If there was, or if we encountered some aliens that we could talk to in a sort of a wide manner, I don't mean some sort of secret aliens, but I mean if there was real contact with an alien civilization that was very advanced, then they could kind of put us in our place and show us our bullshit. Although, I suspect that what would actually happen if that contact ever did occur is that mankind would be very much in denial about our own bullshit. And what we would do is we would actually project it out onto the aliens such that we would demonize the aliens because they would make us feel so ignorant. Rather than accepting our own bullshit and ignorance, it's much easier for us to demonize the aliens and then go to war with them. Of course, realistically, they'd probably be so advanced that we couldn't really attack them. But nevertheless, we could demonize them. We could create conspiracy theories and ideologies about them. And all of that would just be a defense mechanism from admitting our own bullshit, our own, centuries and millennia of bullshit, religious bullshit, scientific bullshit, historical bullshit, and cultural, political bullshit, and so on. Now, you would think that science should champion not knowing, and that science, in fact, likes to admit that it doesn't know. It's like, Leo, science is not like religion. It's like religion claims to know everything, but science doesn't claim to know everything absolutely. Science is humble. And science admits that there's a lot of the universe that we don't know. In that sense, science is a little bit better than religion. But still, what many scientists and scientifically minded people don't understand is the degree to which science only pays lip service to not knowing. And even the stuff, never mind the stuff that science admits we don't know. Okay, that's good, that's correct. But the stuff that science says that we do know, that stuff itself, I want to tell you, we don't actually know. And science is grossly overestimating its understanding of even the stuff that it thinks that we know. And so there's sort of a game that science plays where it plays this game of false humility. And that actually, even though science says that it's humble, science is incredibly arrogant. Now, that doesn't mean religion is correct. Religion is also incredibly arrogant, in many ways even worse than science, right? There's degrees here. It's not just a binary of choosing between science and religion. Now, if you want to know more about the problems of the epistemology of science, go check out my 3-part series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science, where I go really in depth on that. Don't have time to go into it here again. So I just want to point that out to you, though, that society and culture pressures us to make up shit when we actually don't know. And not knowing is treated as a weakness, as if knowing is trivial and easy, and you should just blindly accept the things that humanity already knows, because it already knows them. It's treated as though not knowing isn't even an option. However, not knowing is actually often the best option. It's often an option that is rarely recognized and utilized. And the point of this episode is to help you to see that and to make the counterintuitive move in your life to start to actually exercise this very good option that most people refuse to exercise. Fundamentally, people are extremely conformist and are too lazy to question from scratch. So what people do is they just adopt whatever ideas work for the purposes of their survival in the time that they're living in, the society and culture that they're living in. Because most survival takes place collectively for humans. This is both a blessing and a curse because we can kind of create our own conceptual castles and allow ourselves to survive that way. Because, if you invent the fiction of money and I invent the fiction of money and we all invent the fiction of money, then it's as though money is real. This is a blessing and a curse because on the one hand, it's a blessing we can construct this abstraction called money and use it to trade goods and services much more easily than we otherwise would. On the other hand, it opens Pandora's box as far as self-deception and various sorts of trickery and shenanigans goes, because now we can sort of manipulate this abstract concept of money. We can confuse it with something real and tangible in the world. The concept can get disconnected from real and tangible things. Then we can have all sorts of manipulations of stock markets and currencies and inflation, and you can make money as quickly as you can lose money. You can print more money magically. With the press of a keystroke, some government entity can just create money out of thin air. How is that possible? Seems like magic. Well, it is. That's the power of these kinds of abstractions. But this power goes in both directions, can be used for good and for evil. Now, the ancient skeptics, the Pyrrhonians, they try to tell us that knowing was impossible. But in the Western intellectual tradition, we didn't take them seriously. If you want to know more about that, go check out a book called The Outlines of Pyrrhonism by Sextus Empiricus. It's an old book, nearly 2,000 years old. It outlines arguments made by the ancient skeptics from Greece, but Sextus Empiricus was a Roman. He was writing about the Greeks. And also, that skeptical philosophy also carried over into Rome, of course, because there was a lot of sort of cultural pollination, cross-pollination between Greece and Rome. But there are some brilliant arguments laid out there by the Pyrrhonians as to why nothing can be known. Very powerful arguments. And yet, what mankind did is just sort of like skip over those arguments, because the arguments are like airtight. But mankind couldn't help itself, because for mankind, what we care about is not the truth of some argument. What we care about is what's practical, what works, what's instrumental. And so because knowledge was pragmatic and instrumental, we just carried forward, building and building and building upon our base of knowledge, without seriously considering what is the cost of this. You can do that. You can use knowledge in a pragmatic and instrumental manner, the way that science does, for example, the way that business does, but with a deep cost. What is that cost? Most people who are knowing about anything, they don't consider this cost. Well, the cost of knowing is closed-mindedness, getting stuck in one's simplistic narratives, ideology, self-deception. I have a 3-part series on self-deception, so this connects with that. Go check that out. I have another episode called Assumption is the Mother of All Fuck-Ups. Go check that one out. This connects with that very well as well. Another cost is confusing the map for the territory. I'm going to have an episode about the map versus the territory in the future as well. It'll connect with this episode here. Another cost is a distorted perception of reality, becoming lost in fantasy. That's fundamentally what's happened to mankind, individually and also collectively. We're lost in fantasy. Even science, even mathematicians and logicians, they're lost in fantasy. Science is a conceptual fantasy, no different than religion. It just has the flavor of something objective and tangible and material, like science, but it's a conceptual fantasy. As is logic and mathematics. And we forget that. And the ultimate cost of pursuing this pragmatic instrumental knowledge is a disconnection from being, consciousness, and spirit. And of course, love, and truth, because those are all identical. The ego mind hates uncertainty. It would rather have a false certainty than stand in a place of, I don't know. This is the fundamental sort of driver of why mankind invents these conceptual fantasies, whether they be religious ones or scientific ones or whatever, logical ones, is that the mind just doesn't like sitting in uncertainty. The ego mind creates narratives to ground itself in reality and to help itself to survive. If it didn't do this, survival would be much harder. And the ego mind itself would have difficulty forming into a coherent identity, a coherent self. So this is very fundamental. It goes to the core of who you think you are and what you think others are and what you think reality is. These are not just philosophical, metaphysical concerns that are just like, so abstract that they're just purely academic. Like, no. This goes to the very core of how you came into existence, how you were born. This goes all the way to the heart of your birth and also your death. This gets very existential. So your mind oversimplifies reality in order to be able to know it. And the reason it has to do this is because reality is infinite. Your mind is finite, so there has to be a simplification process. Now, if you're asking me, well, Leo, how do you know it's infinite? Maybe it's not infinite. Well, I can't explain that here. You have to take my word for it. Trust me that reality is infinite. So a simplification has to take place. And then these simplifications become their own realities. Like science is a simplification of reality, like Newtonian mechanics, that's an oversimplification of a more complex physical material reality. Even general relativity is an oversimplification of how physics actually works. Quantum mechanical models and so forth, those are also simplifications. Scientific models, it's all simplifications because the complexity goes infinitely deep. Our knowledge makes reality feel more solid and objective than it actually is. This is especially the case with science. And here comes in one of my favorite quotes, which is, the better the model, the bigger the problem. I've talked about this before in the past. The better the model, the bigger the problem. This is where science gets stuck. Knowledge has a constructive element to it that is taken for granted by most scientifically minded people and logically minded people. You aren't just coming to know a static, objective world the way that you think when you're in elementary school, and honestly, the way that most adults think of it. What's actually happening is that your mind is playing a constructive, co-creative process as it's coming to know the world. It's also co-creating the world at the same time. You're inventing as you come to know the world. And so the world is actually entangled with your mind, and your mind is entangled with the world. We've talked about this in the past. Especially, I've talked about it. There's this concept called construct awareness that I mentioned in my episode called The 9 Stages of Ego Development, Part 3 especially. I talk about one of the higher stages of ego development is reaching the construct aware stage. There's multiple stages of construct awareness, but as you become more construct aware, you become more aware of how your mind is inventing reality as you're trying to come to know it. So like, when you're looking at a fork, it's not just that there is a fork floating out in space, then you come along and look at it, and it's like, oh, fork, of course. It was always a fork, and now I see it, and it's still a fork. And whether I see it or don't, it's always been a fork and always will be a fork. See, this is just kind of like a simplistic, materialistic, scientific way of trying to understand reality. But then as you become more sophisticated, you realize that no, there wasn't just a fork floating around in empty space, and then I came along one day and found it and just gave it a name. It's not that simple. This fork is actually entangled with my mind. In fact, this fork, it is your mind. This is your mind. I'm rotating your mind right now. You see? There's a lot that could be said about construct awareness, and maybe I'll have some episodes about that in the future specifically, but we have to move on. So that concept comes into play here. I want you to start to notice that. So this makes knowing a lot more difficult, because if your mind is playing a role in constructing and inventing reality as you're looking at stuff and analyzing stuff, dissecting stuff, doing science on it, how do you distinguish like what's there before the mind? Or is there even such a concept? Is that even a valid concept? Is there something here before my mind gets to it? It's an open question. So whatever enables your survival gets rationalized as true knowledge and how reality is. That's simply because it works. But the problem with that is that there's a lot of stuff that could work, which is not actually true to how reality is, which is why lying is so common. And for example, if you want a quick example of this, look at Newtonian mechanics. We know that Newtonian mechanics is not technically how reality works. And yet, it's still useful if you want to calculate the trajectory of a projectile to shoot a neighboring city, shoot some artillery shells into your neighboring city that you hate because you're at war. It works for that. But that doesn't mean that's how reality actually is. But there's an even deeper issue here, which is that the mind has a primordial need to know itself. There's a deep curiosity that runs throughout mankind as a whole, throughout our intellectual traditions, throughout our culture. We want to know ourselves. We want to figure ourselves out. This is what mankind has been doing since the dawn of civilization. We've been figuring ourselves out. We've been figuring out the world. We've been figuring out reality. And of course, reality is us and we are reality. And you as an individual, you have a curiosity to know too. Little children have an innate curiosity. They ask kind of stupid questions like, why is the sky blue? And then if you tell them, well, it's blue because, there's certain chemicals in the atmosphere and the sun bounces off at a certain angle and makes it blue. And then they ask you, well, but why are those chemicals there? And then why, the whys never stop. See, that's what I'm talking about by that primordial desire to know itself. Mind has a primordial desire to know itself, individually and collectively. But most people don't understand what this primordial desire is. We kind of think of it as something kind of frivolous, like, oh, well, we're just kind of curious. A little kid is just kind of curious about the colors of the sky. It's like, oh, well, is there anything deep there going on? It's like most people would say, no, they're just kind of like, they're just being kids. Or even if you're like a fancy scientist in a university, you might say, well, no, like Leo, I have a deep primordial desire to understand the universe. Okay, well, my question to you is why? Why? And you might say, well, it's because of, natural selection, because I evolved from a series of apes and other ancestors of ours. And then, knowledge was very helpful for survival. And those creatures and those tribes who understood reality better and deeper, they got a survival advantage, and therefore they out-evolved and out-competed and out-survived all the other tribes. And so here we are today, and that's still going on, and science is just a continuation of that. That's a cool story, but that's not really why you have this desire. The reason you truly have this desire is because God or reality wants to know itself. And you are God. I'm not going to get too deep into that. I've talked about that elsewhere. Just throwing that little nugget out there for those of you who are in the know. You are God, you are reality, you're trying to know it's yourself. But you don't understand this yet. And so you're struggling, you're struggling to figure stuff out. You're curious. You don't even know why you're curious. You just know you're curious. You might wonder, like, well, what's the big deal? Like, why would reality want to know itself? The first problem here is that most people, in fact, most scientists, materialists, rationalists, atheists, and so forth, they would deny that reality can even know itself. They would say, no, Leo, humans want to know themselves and want to know reality. Reality itself doesn't care and doesn't want to know it. It can't know anything. How can reality know itself? It's just a dumb material system. It can't know itself. Well, you're wrong there. The problem is you don't really know what reality is. You don't know reality to such a deep extent that you don't even know yet that reality can know itself, because you're not recognizing that you actually are reality. Reality is not something other than you, it's you. So if you want to know yourself, if you have curiosity, that means reality has curiosity. That's not a trivial point. That's a very deep point. But to get that, to get the depth of it, you have to get some awakenings and some God realizations in there. So reality wants to know itself. You might wonder, well, why would reality want to know itself? What's so important about that? Well, reality is an infinite mind, FYI. That's news to you. Reality is an infinite mind. And what else is there for an infinite mind to do but come to know itself ever more deeply? That's the only business that God is in, that consciousness is in. The business of consciousness is self-understanding, self-knowing, self-realization, awakening to itself. That's the motive force behind all of consciousness, is that it's trying its damnedest. It's struggling with itself to awaken. And so your curiosity, that primordial desire to know stuff, you hear a noise in your basement and you're curious, like, well, what's that noise? Well, guess what? That's a little bit, like a little tip of the iceberg. Like, the reason you're curious about that noise, it's not just to save your ass from some predator or some serial killer who could be hiding in your basement. It is that to some degree. You can use that knowledge to help you survive, but something more primordial and fundamental is going on at the existential level. And at the existential level, the reason you're curious about these things is because you're God and you want to ultimately understand yourself and to awaken to the fact that you're God, even though you don't realize that yet. And that curiosity is how you're going to do it. That curiosity is sort of the tether. It's the thing that tethers you to God. It's the thing that keeps you from being lost from God forever, because you can use that thread of curiosity to awaken yourself. If you follow it long enough. The problem is that most people don't really appreciate what that curiosity can do for them, and they don't follow it long enough, deep enough to realize, that thread will lead you back to God. If you're curious enough about reality, long enough, deep enough, seriously enough, with enough commitment and passion, you will eventually reach God by following that breadcrumb trail. It's just that most people don't do it. And also, it's so counterintuitive and it's so tangled and it's so convoluted that it's very easy to get lost. And it's very easy to fall into all sorts of traps and deceptions along the way, and you'll get brainwashed by other people and knocked off track. So you'll very easily lose track of the breadcrumb trail. And so my job is to help lay out that breadcrumb trail for you, make the breadcrumbs a little bit more visible than they normally are, motivate you to go on the journey of following this breadcrumb trail and seeing where it leads you. And where it will lead you to is infinity. So reality is trying to know itself, but reality doesn't recognize itself as infinite, and it keeps trying to grasp itself with finite concepts. And it keeps failing and failing and failing, and its curiosity is never fully satisfied. So what I mean here, the best example of this is with science, right? So science is trying to understand the universe, supposedly. And so every year science is doing more lab studies. sending out new probes to different planets to the edge of space, our solar system. And we're exploring new planets and asteroids, and we're looking through telescopes, billions of light years into the future or into the past, to see, what was going on in the early universe and so forth. And we're constructing models, and we're writing textbooks, and we're creating these grand narratives of like, we came from this big bang, and then that exploded, and then matter precipitated, and then there were stars, and then there were explosions and supernovas and black holes, and then there were planets, and Earth came along, and then 4 billion years passed, and then there were apes and mammals and monkeys and humans and this, right? So we construct these narratives and stories. And all the while we think as scientists that, okay, like we're getting close to figuring this whole thing out. But what we're not realizing is that we're nowhere near close to figuring it out, because all these are finite concepts, and what we're trying to figure out is infinity itself. And it's not clicking in our minds that you can't get to infinity through any series of finite concepts, no matter how long you keep doing that. And we keep hoping that, no, Leo, maybe, if we give science another 100 years, they'll figure it out. It's like, no. It won't work. Yeah, but Leo, how can you be so sure? You can't know that. See, this is where it gets tricky. Because you might say, well, Leo, you're contradicting yourself, because you're telling us that you can't know anything, not knowing. You're stressing not knowing, and here you are trying to like act like you know everything. You say you know God, and you say you know infinity, and you say, science can never figure it out and all this blah, blah. How do you know these things? Aren't you supposed to not know? Yeah, it's a paradox. I'll grant you that. Before I'll answer that later in this episode, but before that, we have to do some work. So here's the key point. Reality is too profound to be knowable. I'll say that again. Reality is too profound to be knowable. If you think reality can be knowable, you're deeply underestimating what reality is. This is the fundamental error of science. It's the fundamental error of logical people who think they can logic their way out of this problem. You can't logic your way out of this. You can, however, awaken to the profundity of what reality is. And that is a step beyond knowing. That's something deeper. That's something more primordial. We'll talk about that as we keep going. So the bottom line is that the counterintuitive move here, remember I talked about counterintuitive moves? Go see my episode called The Counterintuitive Nature of Life. We're bringing a lot of stuff together here, huh? I'm kind of delivering on my promise to interconnect everything. So we're connecting a lot of dots here in this episode. In that episode, I talked about various counterintuitive aspects of life and moves you could make, and, how to make your way into a good, profound life through counterintuitive moves. Well, here's one counterintuitive move that will transform your whole life is stand in I don't know. Stand in it, bask in it. See where it leads you. It'll lead you to places you could not have even anticipated. I promise you that much. But it's difficult to stand in I don't know, because it's counterintuitive, because the ego wants to know. It takes a lot of humility, honesty, wisdom, and seriousness to admit I don't know. Not knowing is scary and threatening. And notice this, the more you know, the more you have to lose by admitting I don't know. So this is an especially big trap for religious people, but even more so perhaps for scientific people, for mathematicians, for logicians, for computer nerds. Because these types of people, public intellectuals, authors, academics, these type of people have built their whole lives and careers on priding themselves on knowing more than everybody else. I know because I've done that. I'm somewhat of a public intellectual. I've been interested in philosophy my whole life. I've been very academic. I've prided myself a lot on knowing more than others. So I'm intimately familiar with the arrogance, the sort of intellectual arrogance and pride that comes with that. Maybe you're familiar with some of my own intellectual arrogance and pride that came from that. But I'm very well aware of that. You have to understand. A lot of intellectuals are not. And hey, I'm not saying I'm perfect. I also fall into those traps as an intellectual. So the trick here is you have to muster the courage to not know. And the way to muster that courage is to just recognize within your own self that's like, it's better for me to admit that I've been wrong once than to forever spend the rest of my life pretending that I'm right and playing that game. You know, like for me personally, it's much easier just to admit that I was wrong because I only got to do that one time. It's just like a one day's worth of pain. But living, repressing and suppressing the truth that I was wrong for my whole life and acting as though my past beliefs and past worldview are right, even though I suspect that they're not, that's a recipe for pain for the rest of my life. So for me, it's pretty easy to admit being wrong when you kind of frame it that way. Because this really, the scales tip very much in favor of admitting you're wrong. But you have to kind of like think long term, right? Most people aren't thinking long term, so for them, they just want to kind of save themselves from the sort of short-term embarrassment of admitting they've been wrong. Like, here's an example. That was kind of abstract. Let me make it specific. Like, let's say you're a Mormon. It's a lot easier to just admit that Mormonism is basically a cult and that is deeply wrong. It's a lot easier to admit that, bite that bullet, suffer through a few months of withdrawal and whatever else, than it is to go on living your whole life within this Mormon cult. Doing years and decades of mental gymnastics trying to, square in your own mind why Mormonism is right. Because, that's a full-time job. Because Mormonism is so wrong, you're going to spend the rest of your life justifying it to yourself just to maintain that belief system. And hey, I'm not picking just on Mormonism here. This will apply to Islam. This will apply to Christianity and many other things. But hey, a lot of people would rather just dig their head in the sand and just pretend as though their belief system, their worldview is right, and ignore all the counter evidence and not think very deeply about it. The nice thing about not knowing is that it sobers you out of fantasy. And that's what Mormonism is. It's a fantasy. That's what Christianity is. That's what Islam is. They're fantasies. Buddhism is a fantasy. Science, materialist science is a fantasy. Physics is a fantasy. These are fantasies. Not knowing is a powerful antidote to self-deception. Remember my series, 3-part series on self-deception? If you don't, go rewatch it. Very powerful series. And I give you a list of various self-deception mechanisms. I don't even remember. I haven't watched that in a few years. I don't remember. Did I give you antidotes in that series? How to deal with self-deception? Well, if I did not, then here's your antidote, not knowing. Very powerful. And that's not the only antidote to self-deception, but that's a very powerful one. Remember also I have an old episode called How Paradigms Work, where I talk about this concept called paradigm lock, where you get locked into a paradigm. Well, what's the antidote to paradigm lock? Guess what? Not knowing. That's one powerful antidote, not the only one. Not knowing breaks you out of closed-mindedness. Go check out my episode, How Open-Mindedness Works, and also another one called Radical Open-Mindedness. I stress open-mindedness a lot in my work. What do you do if you're closed-minded? Well, practice not knowing, and then your mind will open. But a closed-minded person precisely does not want to practice not knowing. So how do you get a closed-minded person to agree to practice not knowing? Well, you can't force them, only if they want to. And most of them won't. So I'd like you to start to become sensitive and brutally honest with yourself about when you really don't know a thing. This requires introspection. Go see my episode called Developing Introspection. You can develop an introspection with kind of attunement. You kind of focus inwards, as I talked about in that episode, you focus inwards and you kind of feel around in there. When some topic comes up, like, let's say, how old is planet Earth? You could just immediately parrot out some number that you heard some scientist tell you in some textbook, like it's 4.3 billion years old. You could say that, or you could go, wait a minute. Do I really know how old the Earth is? You can introspect on that point. You can realize, okay, I got some ideas from some book that I read. That's one thing, but truly I don't know. You can feel into the truth of I don't know is deeper than the truth of what you read in some book that you instinctively want to parrot out as the good little scientist that you fancy yourself to be. So that's a practice. You practice that for the rest of your life. That's what I'm suggesting with this episode. If you're wondering, like, Leo, this is so abstract, what do I do with this? You practice that. You actually do that. You introspect, you stop yourself from just parroting stuff you've heard from other apes, and you actually go into the I don't know. Now, with I don't know, it's very tricky because not knowing, you can hold it as a theory, or you can actually be in a state of not knowing. These are two different things. What you've gotten so far from me in this episode is just theory. It's the theory of not knowing. And you can sit there and you say, like, I don't know this, I don't know that. Yeah, Leo, I can kind of accept the idea that maybe I don't know as much as I thought I knew, or that maybe some of the things I know are kind of wrong or self-biased or whatever. Yeah, I can agree with that, Leo. Okay. What do I do with that? That's theory. That's the theory of not knowing. That theory is not the same thing as actually being in a state of not knowing. So you have to distinguish those two. And so now the real goal of this episode is getting yourself into a state of actual not knowing. Not just the theory that I'm talking about here. So towards that end, let's do this exercise. I want to take you through an exercise that will put you into a genuine state of not knowing, if you're open to that. So let's try that. So I'm going to have you close your eyes. Only do this if you're in a safe place, sitting down, you're not driving, or in a place where you can hurt yourself. So you're going to close your eyes, sit back, relax. This will just be a short exercise here. Short little kind of guided visualization. So there you are, comfortable, sitting, relaxed. Now we're going to try to create a state of not knowing. I want you to erase from your mind the notion of a past or history. Anything in the past, including all the wars you learned about in school, all the events of human civilization, mankind, World War I, World War II, ancient Rome, ancient people that lived in the past, Julius Caesar and Hitler and all this kind of stuff. Just erase all that from your mind. Instead of all that backstory, we're going to call that backstory, erase all that backstory and just leave a blank space of mystery and not knowing. Likewise, let's do the same with the future. Notice that you have ideas about the future. What's going to happen next year, next week, where you're going to be in 50 years, what the world is going to be like, mankind evolving in the future, new technology, flying cars, and electric technology, and we're going to be, mankind is going to be on the planet Mars and across the solar system, in hundreds of years. You probably anticipate something like that. All of that future story, just like the backstory, the future story, kind of try to grab it all at once in your mind and just dissolve that. Dissolve that out of your mind until it dissolves into just an empty space of not knowing and mystery, where in that not knowing, anything is possible. The future is not pinned down in any way. And also notice the difference of how this feels in your body when you, just a minute ago, you sort of had a backstory and a future story that were kind of tangible. And now you dissolve those away, and now you're in a state of not knowing relative to those. Notice how different that feels when you truly don't know the past and you truly don't know the future. That just leaves you with right now, with your experiences right now. Now, right now, you're sitting there with your eyes closed. It's kind of dark, probably. You can feel your body. You can see this blackness. But notice you have a knowingness of the room or the space that you're sitting in. You're probably sitting in your house or apartment somewhere. But if your eyes are closed, you don't actually see the room. You don't see your house. You don't see the roof of your house. You don't see your car. You don't see maybe some other family member in the room adjacent to you. You don't see any of that. You don't experience any of that, let's say. So erase all those from your mind so that you're very in the present moment. I want you to also even erase knowledge of your own body. Because with your eyes closed, you have a self-image. You have a sort of an image of the back of your head and your whole torso and body, the way that you would look in a photograph. You probably have remnant images of memories from the past. Even though you're supposed to erase the past, you probably have personal memories from the past that define who you are in the present. Childhood memories, stuff that happened to you yesterday, what you had for lunch this morning, this sorts of stuff. Erase all of that and replace it with just a state of not knowing. Also, check if you have any ideas or sort of a backdrop of scientific or religious metaphysical worldview. By which I mean, you think that you're sitting there made out of atoms. That would be the scientific backdrop. Or you're made out of cells. Your body's made out of bones and tissues, and you have a brain, that kind of stuff, that you were born, that you're an animal, that you evolved through evolution over billions of years. That's the scientific backstory. Or maybe you have a religious backstory of like, you were created by God, and this God, maybe it's the Christian God, and you have an idea of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and this kind of stuff, all the Bible stories. Like, erase all of that. Maybe you're a Buddhist and you have an idea of like all the Buddhas of the past who became enlightened and who worked hard for mankind to teach you about Buddhism. Erase that. And so eventually you get to if you do all this and you erase basically everything, all you're left with is just the raw experience of the present moment. And now I want you to deeply feel into the truth. And now this is truth here. This is not just some idea. Recognize that this is truth. You don't actually know what any of the raw experience that you're having right now is. You're hearing some sounds. you're feeling perhaps your ass on the chair. If you're sitting down, maybe you're feeling some pressure on your feet if you're standing up. Maybe you're feeling some cold or some warmth just from the ambient temperature of the room. Maybe you're hearing some buzzing noises from the air conditioning or whatever. Get in touch with the fact that you don't know what any of this is, and enter a profound state of complete not knowing. Imagine that you're like a little baby just born, that you were just born this minute, and you don't know what anything is. You don't have any concept or words for anything. You don't know yourself, and you don't know any of the objects or the environment or the sensations. And even if you're having some kind of emotion, whether it's happiness, sadness, anger, confusion, you don't know what any of those are either. So complete state of not knowing. Try to enter that. Try to create that. And if you're saying to yourself, well, Leo, I don't know how to create that, just try it. Just do it. Just have the intention to create it. Will it into being. Try that. And now contrast this current state of not knowing, if you're able to do this, contrast it with your usual state of knowing. And also contrast it with the theory of not knowing. Remember, I was talking about the theory of not knowing versus actual not knowing as a state. So right now you're in an actual state of not knowing. Contrast that with just the theory we were talking about earlier and your usual mode of being, where you think you know where you are and what you're doing. Let's say you're sitting in your house right now doing this exercise, and you've entered what you would think is a state of not knowing, actual, genuine state of not knowing. Here's the litmus test. If you still think you're in your house, you're not an actually genuine state of not knowing. Because how would you know you're in your house? How would you know what a house is? Right? So take this as deep as you can go to the point where open your eyes now, open your eyes and try to maintain your sense of not knowing and look around the room, look around your house, let's say, look around your apartment, but still in not knowing. And the not knowing is so deep that you don't even know that you're in a house. Because how do you know this is a house? You can't see the roof. You can't see what's on the outer walls. Also, you have to remove the idea that you're on planet Earth. How would you know you're on planet Earth? You can't know that from being inside of some room. When you can get to that state, that would be close to what I mean by a state of genuine not knowing. And in fact, you can go even deeper than this, but let's just cut it off here because we got to move on to other points. So you got that? That's very practical, right? That's not a theory. What just happened, that was a shift in your state. That wasn't a theory. And so make that distinction between a shift in your state versus talking about not knowing. Because you can talk about not knowing till you're blue in the face, but you're not necessarily going to get a shift in your state into not knowing. Right? Again, like, look, let's say you're a Christian. If you're a Christian, there's actually a profound difference between just, as a Christian, we might have a logical debate about Christianity versus science, and I might even be able to convince you that, how do you know Christianity is really true? Maybe the Bible was just written by some fraud. How do you know Jesus really existed? And you might hear all those things. You might even agree with me and say, yeah, Leo, I don't even know if Christianity is really true. Maybe it's not true. That's the level of theory, right? There's a difference between that, just admitting that there might be problems with Christianity, versus actually entering a state where you have no idea whether Christianity is true. Now, for you scientists, it's going to be even harder, though. Because, see, that same logic applies to you scientists and materialists and atheists. Because you've convinced yourself that you're not doing the same thing that the Christian is doing. You don't have anything to let go of as a scientist. Because your worldview is just as reality is, right? Atheism is just as reality is. I'm not adding anything as an atheist. As a scientist, as a physicist, I'm not adding anything like the Christian is, so I have nothing to let go. No, you're very wrong about that. You have all of science to let go. So for you scientific types, there's a very big difference between sitting there and just, for example, listening to my 3-part series where I talk about the myth of, deconstructing the myth of science. Many of you guys have listened to that and have even left me positive comments like, oh my God, Leo, this is very profound. Yes, it's all profound and very good, and you understand it all, and you could recite it back to me. That's all great, but that's not the same thing as being in a state right now of complete not knowing to the point where you don't even know that you're sitting on planet Earth. Do you see the difference? Or rather, I should say, do you feel the difference? Because this is something you should be feeling more than seeing. Like, as I'm sitting here right now, I can wipe away from my mind the idea that Earth exists. So like, normally it just kind of exists in the background of my worldview, but I can wipe that away such that when I'm sitting here, I'm conscious that there is no Earth. That's true. Try to do that. Notice you're going to have like resistance. The ego mind's going to come up and say, oh, no, but Leo, what are you talking about? The Earth's not there. Like, that's just some sort of fantasy. Of course the Earth is there. Where else would it, where else would I be sitting? Where else would my house be located if not on Earth? That's how deep your story and fantasy goes. So you have to work on that. Like, this is something that could take you years of work. You have to understand, I've done years of work on myself to get to the point where I can remove Earth from my worldview. Most people can't do that. That doesn't just happen by luck. You have to work on that. So keep practicing this and working on it. But we have to move on to other things. So anyways, really get comfortable with not knowing, putting yourself in this state. Tell yourself that it's okay not to know. Periodically, what you should do is wipe the slate clean. There's this notion that I'm inventing called wiping the slate clean, which, I didn't invent that phrase, but what I mean by that phrase is when you wipe the slate clean, it's like you take your whole worldview and you just wipe it all away. You're not just like tinkering at the edges of your worldview. It's like, oh, well, yeah, I can adjust this little piece of my worldview and this little piece. Like, this is what scientists do. It's like, yeah, they got a massive worldview. And then what they do is they tinker around the edges, adjusting little things here and there. But fundamentally, nothing has changed. They still believe they're sitting on planet Earth. They still believe that a Big Bang happened. They still believe that there's space and time. They still believe that humans evolved, like that their body's made of atoms. All that shit is still there. And then they're just tinkering around the edges. Wipe the whole thing away. And don't replace it with anything. See, you're going to be like, well, Leo, if I wipe that away, I got to replace it with something. No, leave it blank. That's what's counterintuitive here. Leave it blank for as long as you can. The problem with knowing too much is that it prevents insights, understanding, and awakening from happening. So this wiping the slate, this not knowing state, will create space. You're emptying your cup, creating space for new insights and understandings to come and for a potential awakening to spark. That's why we're doing this. There's this practical point. All right, now I got one more exercise for you. This one's going to be a little easier. It's not going to be a visualization exercise. I'd like you to get a piece of paper, and I'd like you to admit of 10 things that you claim to know, but that you actually do not know. So at the top of the paper, write down, what are 10 things that I claim to know, that I've claimed my whole life to know, but that I actually don't know and never knew? So for example, is the Earth 4 billion years old? Most people would claim yes, if they're scientifically minded. And now I want you to admit that you don't actually know that. That's the truth. See, there's an additional point here, a little kind of nuance, a wrinkle. When we're creating this not knowing, it's not just that we're trying to like create a fantasy of not knowing. We're actually trying to get to the truth of what you know in these situations. And the truth is that you actually don't know. Like, if you really like ask yourself, what is the truth of what I know about the age of the Earth? The answer, the truest answer you can muster is, I don't know. Another example, many of you guys, maybe like me, take fish oil supplements, right? Maybe you've been taking fish oil supplements for years. Now, I want you to admit you don't actually know if fish oil is any good for you. Is it actually improving your health, or is it actually harming you? Now, you have a story in your mind if you take fish oil supplements that, of course, they're helping me. But do you really know that? Is that really in your direct experience? Here's where you have to be very honest with yourself. So again, introspect and really dig deep and be extra honest and just admit to yourself finally that I have no fucking idea if this fish oil is doing anything good for me. In fact, maybe it's causing cancer. I don't know. I have no idea. And as you do that, also notice that that's not a fantasy. That's the truth. That's the raw truth. Another example, did Jesus really exist? Again, go inside, really introspect, be very honest with yourself, and look for the truth of the matter. And what you'll discover is that you don't know. Here's another example, a little bit more radical, a little bit more scary. Do other people have consciousness? Can you handle that? Go inside, ask yourself, do other people have consciousness? What is the rawest truth I have about this? What do I ultimately know about this? The consciousness of others. And what you should notice is that the deepest truth you have about that is that you don't know. Another example, is God real? Go inside, really get honest with yourself. What do you know about God? Now, for some of you who've been doing this work, this won't apply, but for most of you who've never had a direct consciousness of God and are not conscious of it right now, for you, the answer is you don't know. And if you're an atheist, guess what? The truth is you don't know. And if you're a Christian, the truth is you don't know. Notice that. Now, these are just examples that I threw out there, but I want you to come up with a list of 10 of your own examples where you do this. As you do this, you're going to have to get very honest with yourself, more honest than you usually are. You're going to have to notice when you're bullshitting yourself, and you're going to notice in certain cases, you ask a question of yourself, like about the fish oil. It's kind of like, but I don't want to admit, I don't want to admit that I've been spending all this money on fish oil for the last 10 years, and that actually the truth is I have no idea what it might be even harming me. Like that's difficult to admit. And that's just fish oil. Never mind, Maybe you ask yourself a question like, do I love my own family? And you might usually you say, yeah, of course. But if you really go deep down inside, get to the truth of, do I really love my own family? You might discover that you don't. Or you might discover that you're not sure if you love them. That's scary. That's hard to admit. It's hard to admit to yourself, let alone to admit it to others. This is a good exercise in practicing honesty. Go check out my video series called The Avoidance of Truth, which goes into that, right? So the problem here with really not knowing is that really it's sort of a defense mechanism against avoidance of truth. And you're going to have to admit, as you're doing this exercise, you're going to write down these 10 things, and then I want you to look over these 10 things, and I want you to admit that you were posturing to yourself. You were posturing that you knew these things. You were putting up a facade of knowing when in fact you didn't know. And I want you to kind of call yourself out on that. It's like, I've been posturing that Jesus is real, but all along I didn't know. And now I finally caught myself posturing. I've been posturing for 20 years. And finally, I've admitted that I've been posturing. That's a huge breakthrough right there. Likewise, I've been posturing that fish oil is good for you, but I never knew. And I've spent thousands of dollars on it. And I've just been posturing all this time. That's a huge admission. So do that. And then, very importantly, I want you to forgive yourself for this posturing. Because you're going to want to feel bad. You're going to guilt yourself and judge yourself for being stupid or foolish or ignorant or whatever, for for tricking yourself or deceiving yourself. But now you have to forgive yourself for posturing and for self-deception. Because, hey, the mind is very tricky. And in the end, your mind was just trying to help you to survive. You were being a bit selfish and unconscious. And now you're becoming more aware, and you can forgive yourself. You can understand how you were ignorant, you were in denial, and you can forgive yourself for being in denial and for posturing. So do that exercise. Pause this if you need to and do that. And the conclusion from this exercise is you need to get good at recognizing when something you think you know, you don't actually know. And start holding yourself to this higher standard. Ask yourself, do I really know, or am I just pretending like I know? And a lot of times you'll be shocked to realize that I'm just pretending. Belief and hearsay is not real knowing. Direct experience is king. You have to ground yourself in direct experience. Your mind has been filled with a lot of belief and hearsay. And now it's time to admit that belief and hearsay, while it might be correct, a lot of times it isn't correct, a lot of times it's wrong, but it's ultimately, you don't know whether the belief or the hearsay is true. Like, you have a belief that the Earth is 4 billion years old, but you haven't verified that yourself. It could be wrong. Science could discover something new tomorrow that would, say that the Earth is actually 5 billion years old or 2 billion years old. You don't know. That's the truth. Because you don't have any direct experience of the Earth's age. In fact, you don't even have a direct experience of the Earth, if you're really honest. At least not as this blue ball spinning in space, the way that you conceive of it. You have some direct experience of the Earth, but it's very different than this round conception of this ball that you've seen on pictures. So let's move on to the next point, which is rather deep and important. and which is that all knowledge is fundamentally second order. What do I mean by second order? All knowledge is about something. It's about being. Being is first order. Knowing about being is second order. Right? So the raw sensations of this fork are the being. That's first order. And then your knowledge of the fork, including the fact that it is a fork and whatever a fork is used for and what you think a fork is made out of, where it came from, where it's going, and etc. And the fact that it's called a fork and all the associated concepts that come with fork, all of that is second order. I want you to notice that. You couldn't have all those associations and ideas about what to do with it, how it works, what it's for, what it's made out of. You couldn't have any of that if you didn't have the thing there to begin with. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? This is not rocket science. It's pretty obvious. Now, here's the trick, is that your knowledge of the fork makes you feel like you know the being of the fork, which you don't. You know what the fork can be used for. You know how much it costs. You know what'll happen if you melt it down. You know where it came from, and so on. But none of that tells you what it is. You see that? So you have to make a distinction between your knowledge of what you can do with things, how you can use them, versus what a thing is. And so a lot of times that's confused. And since us as humans, like usually it doesn't really matter to us what the fork is. What matters to us is what we can use it for. So as long as we know what we can use it for, and as long as you can manipulate it, with some skill and use it to get the things you want, your ego wants, then it's like, well, then I know the fork because, hey, I can use it. I can use this to survive, and that's all I care about. And then the question of what is the being of this fork, who even gives a fuck? That's not even a valid question anymore. See, it gets so bad that then some scientists will tell you that, Leo, that's not even a valid question. That's just some sort of metaphysical question like, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin kind of question. But it's not that kind of question, because the being of the fork is the thing that allows for everything else that you know about it. You forgot that the being is first order. See, what you do is you get so focused on the second order and then what you can use it for that you just forget that there even was a first order. The first order is irrelevant. And then the second order by default becomes the first order, because when you don't have the first order, you only have the second order. That is like there's only one order at that point, and you relabel that as the first order. And then you pretend like everything's fine and you go on with your life because it seems to work. So what I want you to recognize is that conceptual knowledge is a way of avoiding direct confrontation with the mystery of the first order, the being. Another word for being is consciousness. So here's one solution for you scientists to the problem of consciousness. Like, you scientists are trying to figure out what consciousness is. Well, you're trying to figure out what consciousness is at the second order. But consciousness is first order. So you're never going to figure out what consciousness is at the second order because it's at the first order. This is consciousness. So if you care about consciousness, then you should care about the first order. And notice, if you stop caring about the first order, you've stopped caring about reality, because reality is nothing but first order. This is the problem with pragmatism that I've talked about in my 3-part series called Deconstructing the Myth of Science. I believe I've talked about it mostly in part 2. but maybe part 3 as well. I forget. Notice something interesting. Notice that your being and your existence is prior to your knowledge of it. You exist, you are, before you know about it. Because before you can know something about yourself, you have to first exist. This is not rocket science, again, but often overlooked. You exist, but you don't know what existence is, or what exactly you are, or how you came to exist. You are alive prior to your knowing what life is. The problem with symbolic second-order conceptual knowledge is that it's so partial, perspectival, relativistic, and finite, and prone to recontextualization that it's very shaky ground. It's not secure, and it gets changed a lot. What do I mean by prone to recontextualization? See my episode called Understanding Recontextualization, where we talk about that. So this fork, if you really do this work deeply, eventually this fork will get recontextualized. See, right now you think this fork is a material metal object made of atoms. Eventually, when you awaken, this fork will get recontextualized as your own mind, or as God, as consciousness, as it'll also get recontextualized as infinity. Right now, you see this fork as a finite object. It'll turn into an infinite object if you become sufficiently woke. Fundamentally, knowing infinity is not possible. Why? Because knowing is second order. You are infinity, but infinity cannot fully know itself. Because knowing is a subset of that infinity, which means knowing is infinity. The isness is so direct, it's prior to being able to self-reflect or to grab around and grasp itself, for the same reason that a hand cannot grasp itself. Reality or infinity cannot grasp itself because it is itself. All knowing is explicit, finite, and a subset of infinity. To get a deeper understanding and appreciation of this point, go see my episode called Explicit versus Implicit Understanding, where we go into a lot of depth about that distinction. Being is inherently irreducibly mystical, mysterious. That's ultimately what mystical means. See, people have the wrong kind of connotation about mystical. Mystical can kind of mean like, oh, it's kind of like airy-fairy or fantastical. That's not really what mystical means. Truly what mystical means is that it's something that's so fundamental that it's too profound to be known. Like I said earlier, it's too profound to be known. So not knowing is mystery, and that's where mysticism comes from, because it's mysterious. And what does mysterious mean? What does mystery mean? Mystery just means that it's infinite, it's first order, therefore you can't grasp it with the second order. That's mystery. This is why mysticism is correct, because you can't grasp infinity with a second order. Or another way to put it is that you can, but it's also but the grasping of it will always be partial and finite and biased, and therefore you will forever miss the infinitude, its full infinitude. This is why scientists cannot find God. You can't find God because God is the totality of everything, and the totality of everything cannot be grasped by a subset of that totality. See? A subset is not the superset. That's what it boils down to. The belief or assumption that reality can be explicitly explained, that needs to be dropped. That's the fundamental error of science. There is a fundamental entanglement between knowing and world, mind and world and self and world. I've also talked about this in my 3-part series, Deconstructing the Myth of Science. At root, knowledge itself is being. Even though I tend to speak of a first order and a second order, like there's the fork, the being of the fork, and then there's all our knowledge of it, and it seems like our knowledge of it is not first order. But that knowledge itself, as it's happening in my skull or in my field of awareness, that knowledge itself is at the same level, it's also an experience. It's also got being. My knowledge of the fork has its own being. You see that? So ultimately, knowledge is being, but it's one being pointing to another being. So the being of the fork, the being of the sensations, thoughts in my mind are grasping and pointing at the fork. That would be the knowledge of the fork. But then if I want to know my own thoughts about the fork, you see, this presents another problem, because how do I grasp that? I'd need to invent new knowledge about the knowledge I had about the fork. This creates an extra layer, see? So we're creating layers and layers and layers, like reality is and consciousness kind of stepping back from itself to observe itself. This is the problem we talked about in that episode called what it means to go meta. This is the going meta problem. Infinity is infinitely meta. So in order to be able to see or observe something, you have to step back from it, and this stepping back from process is an infinite regress into infinity. That's what infinity is. It's an infinite stepping back process. So ultimately, the distinction itself between metaphysics and epistemology will collapse as you enter into not knowing. What you'll realize is that at the deepest level, all knowing is being, and the only way you can know anything is through contact with being. And the deepest form of knowing is a knowing so profound we don't even call it knowing anymore, we call it being now. See, in the end, you know a thing by being it, by experiencing it. So for example, how do you know that you exist? By existing, by being. Sure, you can sit there and think about your existence, but that's second order, you see? Before you can think about your existence, you have to first exist. And if you want to understand what you are at the deepest level, you can't get there through knowing, you got to get there through being. That's what meditation does for you. That's what self-inquiry does for you. That's what psychedelics do for you. So a state of genuine not knowing that we were practicing earlier in that exercise, the first exercise, this brings you closer to truth, consciousness, and God. Because God, infinity, self, consciousness, these are endlessly mysterious because they're endless, they're infinite. And so you can't grasp them through knowing. Now, awakening itself, when you have one, comes with a profound not knowing, because your knowing is replaced with being. It's as though all the sense data in your sensory field becomes your way of knowing. So you're not just knowing using your intellect or your mind. You're not just knowing using language or words or English or concepts. Like, for example, when you wake up, when you have an awakening, you're not just going to know this fork by thinking about it the way you normally do. It's like, oh, fork. Oh, here it is. Okay, cool. It's an object. That's not how you're going to know the fork much more intimately. You're going to know the fork by becoming the fork. As woo-woo and zen as that sounds, it's like I'm that guy. It's like I'm what's his name? Chevy Chase from Caddyshack. Be the ball, be the fork. But that is literally what's going to happen. When you awaken, you'll become the fork, and then you'll truly know what a fork is when you become it, and then you'll really appreciate the difference between knowing the fork by being a fork versus knowing the fork by just thinking about a fork. See, ordinarily when we know things, like within academia, for example, it's like if an academic or a scientist told you to write a description of what a fork is, unwittingly, what is being asked there of you is that let's say some scientist says, okay, write me a 5-page analysis of what a fork is. And you sit down and you write it. But what you're doing there is like you're looking at the fork and you're thinking about it and you're dissecting it with your mind conceptually. It's like it's got 4 prongs on it. It's maybe 7 centimeters tall and 1 centimeter wide, and it weighs so many ounces and blah, 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 right? You can go on forever describing this fork. You can do all that. But there's infinitely more detail that you're actually missing. That's not going to be in your paper about the fork. And your 5-page paper report about the fork has no resemblance to the actual fork, right? The words on the page, the sounds in your mind, those are not forks. And even all your descriptions, the mental imagery, those are still not forks. Imagine an intelligence so great that when this intelligence thought about a fork, the way it did so was not like a human intelligence, which comes up with words and mental images, but literally there was a fork in your fucking head. Imagine thinking in forks. Imagine like a alien superintelligence or a AI superintelligence where it became so intelligent, so conscious that it thought in forks. That means that it doesn't need to talk about like, oh, it's a fork. It doesn't need that 4-letter word. It doesn't need a description of the fork. Because you see how all those are inferior? If I could take this fork and stick it in your fucking skull so that you could fully experience the fork, I would no longer need to call it a fork anymore. I would no longer need to give any descriptions of it. I would no longer need to describe its weight and length and all this sort of scientific stuff to you. You just have a fork in your head, and there it is, bam, you got a fork in your head. Like, you understand what a fork is now. See? And now imagine doing that for everything around you, not just a fork. It would be a direct one-to-one, right? You see how if we're using language, there's like stuff is getting lost in translation because there's an interpretive process, there's a second order. We're talking about something and that's like inferior, right? Like I could explain to a blind person what a sunset is and maybe he could get a little idea of it. It's better than nothing at all. But if I really want to if I really want to get a blind person to understand a sunset, I would have to give him vision. And then his eyes would open. He would no longer be blind. Let's say we do some sort of like neuro operation on his mind, on his brain, I mean. And then he opens his eyes for the first time. He sees a sunset. He's like, whoa, that's a sunset? That's totally different than what you were telling me. It's like, well, but what I was telling you, a lot, I can only tell you so much. A lot was getting lost in translation. So the only way to know what a sunset is to experience a sunset. And the only way to know what a fork is to experience a fork. See? And imagine that you were so conscious and intelligent that you were doing that with everything. And if you were doing that with everything, you would be living at the first order. You wouldn't need a second order. You wouldn't need language. You wouldn't need to give labels to things. You could, but you wouldn't need it. And so I want you to imagine like a really sophisticated AI, or let's say humans meet some aliens who have like heads that are 20 times bigger than ours. Let's say we meet such an alien race 500 years into the future. We meet such an alien race. You might wonder like, how much smarter would those aliens be? And how would they communicate? How would their minds work? Well, here's an idea. Imagine that if two aliens with heads that are 20 times bigger than humans were talking to each other about forks, they wouldn't be making noises about forks. Literally, one alien would create a fork, a physical fork in his head, and the other alien would also create a physical fork in his head. They would be identical forks, and that's how they would communicate what a fork is. I would literally be able to just pass the fork from my head into your head directly. And in this way, I would communicate to you what a fork is perfectly without anything lost in translation, because there is no translation. That's pretty awesome, right? Now you say, Leo, that's crazy. That's like science fiction. You can't do that. Oh, really? What do you think this is? This is your mind. This fork is your mind. You're doing it right now. You're just disconnected from it. If you were awake, you would already understand that this fork is your own mind. Anyways, moving on. I've talked about this notion of omniscience in the past. Omniscience. People get confused about what omniscience is. See, people think when I say omniscience, people say, oh, Leo, well, you're just full of shit, because if you were truly omniscient, why can't you tell me the lottery numbers for tomorrow or something like that? But that's not what omniscience is. Omniscience is happening not at the second order conceptual level of thinking. Omniscience happens at the level of being, at the first order. So like usually when people think of omniscience, it's like, oh, if I'm going to be omniscient, that means I'm going to know everything conceptually that I could possibly want to know. Like, Leo, I want to know, how many kangaroos there are in Australia. And omniscience should tell me that. No, that's not what omniscience is. True omniscience is you realizing that the kangaroos in Australia, how many there are, whatever, that's an image in your own mind. That's what true omniscience tells you. It doesn't give you an answer to how many kangaroos there are. It tells you that the kangaroos in your mind, including Australia, are imaginary. That's real omniscience, right? This fork right here, this is omniscience. The being of this fork is omniscience. That doesn't mean that you'll be able to know how many atoms there are in this fork. Because omniscience will tell you that the number of atoms in this fork is something you're imagining. So if you want to access omniscience, you can't do it at the second order level. You got to do it at the first order level. So maybe that's important for you. You might be wondering, like, Leo, why is this first order important? Why should I care about it? Well, do you want omniscience? It's like, yeah, Leo, I want to know how many kangaroos are in Australia. No, you're not going to get that. That's not omniscience. Well, then, Leo, why would I want it? Well, maybe some things you can't know if you want until you try them. Like, how do you know you want some pizza unless you try some pizza first? See that catch-22 there? I can't prove to you that you will want pizza. You just got to try some pizza and kind of just like trust me that the pizza's good. But if you're so skeptical that you're like, no, Leo, I'm not gonna try a pizza until you prove to me that that the pizza is going to be enjoyable to me. Well, I can't do that. If you're that skeptical, then you're stuck. Your mind is closed. Ultimately, when you awaken, you will know nothing other than that you are God, infinity, and consciousness. It's crucial that you reach a point in your development and your consciousness of total not knowing. Right? So it's not that awakening will give you a bunch of conceptual knowing. It'll do the opposite. It'll remove all conceptual knowing. It'll leave you completely in mystery, endless, infinite mystery. You will know nothing, but you will literally be omniscient. You'll know everything that is worth knowing. Like, you'll become this fork, and that's all you'll care about at that point. You're not going to care about all the second order shit about a fork. That's so inferior to actually being a fork. That's what you got to realize. So if you have not reached a state of complete not knowing, that's something you're missing in your development. That's going to be a significant life-changing inflection point in your journey. And that's a rather late stage development. It might take you decades to reach that point, but it's very worthwhile reaching that point. And when you reach that point, you're still not done. There's a lot more you could do from that point, but it's a good point to reach. At that point, you're going to face the futility of trying to know infinity via the second order. See, most scientists and just people in general who are just curious about life and, study a lot, intellectual type of people, if you're an intellectual, you don't even realize how much energy you are wasting trying to grasp infinity using the second order. In fact, you could be wasting so much life energy doing this that it could be physically making you sick. It could give you chronic diseases. It could be giving you cancer. It could be giving you depression, and you won't even know it because it's just your whole way of life is just like honestly, lately I felt like for the last 20 years of my life, I've just been trying to figure out what reality is. And it's taken a fucking toll on me. It's stressful. It's stressful conceptually figuring out reality. Trying to put all the puzzle pieces together, piece by piece. What is God and what is Christianity and what is Buddhism and what is science and what is this and what is that and how does it all connect and what am I that's stressful. That's stressful. And as an intellectual, you don't even appreciate the stress. And you might justify it to yourself as just that just comes with the territory of being intellectual. Yeah, but that stress is slowly killing you inside. Because you think that you're making progress, but really you're just treading water. You're staying in place. You think you're getting ahead, but you're staying in place. You have a deep thirst for you have a fundamental curiosity, that primordial curiosity to know yourself as God. And that's not being quenched. That thirst is not being quenched by these little bits of nuggets that you get from science or even from religion or even from some Buddhist, douchebag guru sitting there, posturing as some Buddhist wearing a robe. Those little bits of insights, they're not satisfying you. It's almost like you're a person who has never had sex in your whole life and you're so sexually frustrated, but you don't even know what sexual frustration is because you've never experienced the release of a proper orgasm from proper sex. All you've done is you've gotten a little bit of someone's tickled your genitals for a few seconds here and there in life. That's what science is doing. That's what many of these YouTube videos are doing, even many spiritual videos, spiritual teachers, all the new age stuff. What they're doing is they're just tickling your genitals for a few seconds here and there. You're not getting the full thing. You're not getting your brains fucked out when it comes to understanding what reality is. And you're never going to get that through those methods. What you need is a full-blown awakening. And then you'll realize oh my God, that's what all of my curiosity was driving me towards. I needed my brains fucked out my whole life and I didn't know it. And I've been suffering for that. And finally it's happened and now I see what I've been missing. And now finally there's that relief. It's oh my God, it's this giant weight has been lifted off my shoulders. I can fucking relax now for a few minutes. There's a peace that comes with that. A deep satisfaction. Traditional religion, philosophy, and science fail because they try to reach the ultimate via knowing, which is not possible. Not realizing that all knowing is relative, but the ultimate is absolute. So this brings us to the issue of relative versus absolute truth. I've talked about this many times. I have a specific episode on it called, I believe it's called Relative versus Absolute Truth. So go check that out. Relative knowing is knowing something relative to something else. Like, you know what a fork is relative to what a knife or a spoon is. You know what a fork is relative to a non-fork. You know dualistically. You know what you can do with a fork and what you can't do with a fork. You know this fork is small, and then there's other objects that are big, like the earth is big relative to a fork. This is all relative knowledge. But then there's a way of knowing the fork which is absolutely. You can have absolute knowledge of the fork. But what is that? Well, for that, awakening would be required. And also, you couldn't talk about it. You'd have to become the fork. So remember to make a distinction between knowledge of how a thing works and what you can do with it versus the thing itself. Very different. Now, psychedelics produce very powerful states of not knowing. In fact, such deep not knowing is virtually impossible, I would say, otherwise. You don't even know what a state of not knowing is until you've done some psychedelics. A lot of psychedelics, honestly. Psychedelics will take you into deeper and deeper states of not knowing, which is why I consider them one of the most powerful tools in this work, and I advocate for them so passionately. Because honestly, I've been wrestling with this issue of not knowing for a long time. I've known about it, I've thought about it, I've practiced it, but it's only when I got deep into psychedelics that I really started to appreciate what is meant by not knowing. The utility of psychedelics is that they show you how fragile and relative your knowledge is. They also show you the alternative to relative knowledge, which is absolute knowledge. Most intellectuals, of course, are terrified of psychedelics, and rightly so. Science, history, religion, politicians, business people are terrified of psychedelics. Because all those industries and endeavors are built upon these kind of like houses of cards of second-order conceptual knowledge, relative knowledge, biased knowledge, highly partial knowledge. And psychedelics will obliterate and undermine all that, deconstruct all that. Speaking of deconstruction, deconstruction leads to not knowing. And vice versa, not knowing helps with deconstruction. And deconstruction, this is a concept I've talked about in the past quite a bit. If you're not familiar with that, go check out my episode called What is Actualized.org, where I believe I go pretty deep into kind of like framing up what deconstruction is and why we're kind of like deconstructing the mind and what we're trying to accomplish with that. By the way, I need to give special thanks and credit here to Peter Ralston, who's been crucial for inspiring this whole topic of not knowing. He has a book called The Book of Not Knowing. I'm a big fan of. So check out his work. He deserves credit for this topic. He's the first who kind of planted the seed of the importance of not knowing into my mind. And then that seed has been slowly growing like an acorn slowly growing into an oak tree in my own mind. And just only recently, like in the last year, have I really started to appreciate the importance of not knowing, and I'm getting better at working from not knowing. And for me, this has been challenging and a big trap because, like I said, I am very intellectual, and so a lot of the work that I've been doing with Actualized.org for the first 8 years of running this channel in business is I had to put out a lot of knowledge, a lot of content, and I still do put out a lot of content. But now I'm getting kind of more mature in my understanding of how to put out content. And well, there's sort of a paradox that needs to be reconciled between how is it possible that I put out so much content that seems to be so knowledgeable, but at the same time, now I'm talking about not knowing and I'm practicing not knowing. Well, there is this paradox here that I want to point out to you. This is the paradox of not knowing, is that the mature mind admits of not knowing more, but ends up knowing things which the immature mind thinks are impossible to know. So see, the immature mind thinks it's impossible to know what reality is. It's impossible to know what absolute truth is, what God is, what consciousness is, what love is, what infinity is. It's impossible to know the paranormal and things like this, right? It's impossible to know these things. It's impossible to know whether other people exist or not. Impossible. It is when you know a lot of stuff about materialism and also religious dogma and stuff like that, yeah, then it's impossible because your mind is locked down within that paradigm. But as you let that go and you truly reach deep states of not knowing, and then your mind opens up to mystical experiences and awakenings and so forth, and maybe you start working with psychedelics and so forth, then the paradox is that you're going to be knowing less and less, but actually some of the most impossible to know things will suddenly become revealed to you in a very absolute, direct manner. And you will actually know absolute truth, God, consciousness, love, infinity, paranormal stuff. You'll know it, and you'll know it absolutely, not just relatively. And yet at the same time, there's still going to be much you don't know. And it's like, well, how is that possible? Yeah. It's hard to explain how that's possible. It's very mysterious. It's kind of magical. It's unexpected. It's counterintuitive. Here's an important point. Not knowing doesn't mean you have to give up all knowing forever. You can still use knowing in practical ways. You have to be careful not to get lost in epistemic nihilism, skepticism, and cynicism to the point where you become inactive and passive. You can kind of misuse this idea of not knowing in this way of like, this sort of like false skepticism. I have an episode called False versus True Skepticism. Kind of an old one, but an important one. A lot of people misuse skepticism. A lot of science folks do. And you could say like, well, but Leo, nothing can be known. That's what not knowing means. Or it's like, Leo, everything is just subjective. That's what not knowing means. Or it's like, not knowing means that the absolute truth doesn't exist. Or not knowing means that you can't know God. You have to be agnostic. That's not what not knowing means. That's a misuse of not knowing. That's a sort of a epistemic nihilism. And notice that to claim that nothing can be known, that's actually a definitive, absolute statement of knowledge. Or to say that everything is subjective and that there is no absolute, that's a definitive statement of knowledge. You don't actually know that. You don't actually know, for example, that truth doesn't exist. You don't know that. So it's tricky. Be very careful about how this can get misused. Also, remember that you still have to consider survival and your kind of like everyday happiness. Survival and everyday happiness in life requires activity. And not knowing can be disruptive of activity. So be careful that with adopting this state of not knowing, that you don't use that to kind of like derail your whole life. It's like, well, Leo, I was working on my life purpose. I knew that my life purpose, I wanted to become a musician. And I knew that I wanted a family. I wanted to get, I wanted a hot girl, and I wanted to have a couple of kids with her. And I wanted a nice house in the suburbs with a white picket fence. And I wanted, a nice, Mercedes-Benz, couple of Mercedes-Benz in the driveway. That's what I knew I wanted. And I knew I wanted to travel to the Bahamas and, have a nice vacation. And I knew I wanted to play some video games that are coming up. I'm looking forward to some new, Starfield or something, right? It's like, I knew I wanted these things. And now, Leo, you told me about not knowing. And now I believed you. And now I don't know anything. And now I don't even know if I want the Mercedes. I don't know if I want that hot girl. I don't know if I want my kids. I don't know if I want my house. I don't know if I want to go to Bahamas. I don't know if I want Starfield. Well, that's good for you. Be careful with Starfield. But it's like, and now it's like, and Leo, and now I can't even get out of bed in the morning. I don't even know if I want to get out of bed in the morning. And now I'm depressed. And Leo, you've made me depressed. You see what the ego mind will do with this not knowing? So this is very dangerous if it's misused. So you're going to have to kind of like walk and chew gum at the same time here. You're going to have to enter deep states of not knowing, and yet at the same time, you're going to have to keep executing in your life on the practical shit, on those principles, those very fundamental core survival principles, those things I teach about, like your life purpose, maintaining a work ethic, eating good food, exercising, going out, talking to girls, socializing, going to school, getting good grades, doing your meditation practice, or your psychedelic practice if you do that, or going to retreats, doing some hardcore retreats, reading books. Spending time with your kids, not being an asshole to your friends and to your family, working on your intimate relationship, making sure that's going well, communicating consciously and so forth. If you have employees, being a good boss. If you're a coworker, being nice to your coworkers, working on the stuff that needs to be worked on. Like all that shit, those core principles, you got to maintain all that for the most part. And then still enter into states of deep not knowing. And you might say, well, Leo, isn't that a contradiction? If I'm totally in a state of not knowing, then shouldn't I not know, for example, like what my life purpose is? Maybe now I don't know if I want to be a musician or an artist or a filmmaker or a professor or a spiritual teacher. I don't know. Now I don't know. There is a time to question even those principles and even your life purpose. But you have to do that like consciously, and you don't want to let your mind run wild with that to the point of like derailing you. You should have a deep passion for what you're doing. Like if you want to be a musician or a filmmaker, you should have a deep passion for that. That passion should run deeper than any sorts of like conceptual knowledge or ideas. And that passion should survive any states of not knowing. Like that's love, right? What you love, your passion basically comes from what you love. What you love, whether it's your children, your family, whatever. Now, some of those things can be inauthentic. Maybe you don't love. Maybe you realize, you don't want to be a musician. Okay, fine, that's actually good. Now that's kind of tragic. Maybe you have to give up that part of your life, but then you move on and find something that you really do love. So you can use not knowing to question all these things. Just like be careful not to like paint with too broad of a brush where like now you don't know anything and now you're just like demotivated. You can't get out of bed in the morning and you're feeling depressed and now you're eating junk food, right? It's like, see what happens is like, well, Leo, I don't even know if, drinking celery juice, eating healthy, I don't even know if that's good for me because, just like the fish oil, Leo, I don't know. What if pizza's good for me? Leo, what if heroin is good for me? I don't know. So now I'm just going to, use that as an excuse to eat pizza, smoke weed, do heroin, and sit at home, watch cartoons all day, and just like get into a funk of deeper and deeper depression and nihilism to the point where now you become suicidal. Well, you see, obviously that's a trap. Obviously that's not what I'm telling you to do. Again, in this work, as you're exploring the truth and pursuing the truth, your survival is always at stake. It's always an issue. Yeah, pursuing the truth, questioning reality, deconstructing aspects of your worldview, this is going to conflict with your survival. Of course. If it didn't, what would even be the point? Because part of the reason that we're doing this is to enhance your survival, to kind of purify your survival. Because the way that most people are surviving is rather miserable and shallow. So you want to sort of kind of inch your way up or bootstrap yourself in a way where you're using not knowing to question stuff, but you're still motivated and doing the stuff, the healthy stuff, reasonably healthy stuff, right? You don't need 100% certainty about everything. That's another trap here. It's like, well, it sounds like Leo was saying that unless I know something absolutely, I shouldn't be doing it. Like, no. If you're 95% sure you want to be a musician and you're passionate about it, that's enough. You don't need 100% absolute certainty. You don't need God to appear to you in the clouds and tell you and write a stone tablet to you with a 100% guarantee that your life purpose is correct. You don't need that. You're just going to be, when it comes to survival, most of your survival is kind of probabilistic. You're picking out of, a lot of times you're picking out of you have imperfect information and you're just kind of going with the best thing you know. Like, for example, maybe you have 3 ideas. I want to be a musician, or I could be a filmmaker, or I could be an accountant. Which of those seems like I have more passion for? It's like, well, definitely not an accountant, and maybe a filmmaker, but really I love music. It's like, well, am I 100% sure I like music and I'm going to be a great musician? Not 100% sure, but like maybe 90% sure. Okay. And then how sure are you that you want to be an accountant? It's like, well, 10%. Okay, so that's pretty bad. And it's like, well, what about being a filmmaker? Well, maybe like 50%. Okay, but so your best bet is to go for musician, right? Because like you got to act. Survival and happiness requires activity, action. And when it comes to survival, very rarely do you act on something with 100% certainty. But you still want to act decisively towards something. What you don't want to do is kind of like half-ass things where it's like, well, I'm only 90% sure that I want to be a musician, so I'm just going to kind of like half-ass it. I'm just going to like practice with half enthusiasm, put half the energy into it. It's like, no, then you've already failed. You still have to be decisive. I'll have an episode about how to be decisive, so stay tuned for that. That's a tricky topic. So, not knowing can be weaponized. This false skepticism that I talked about, you can start to use not knowing to say that, oh, well, God cannot be known, or you can't know what happens after death. Nobody can know that, right? Leo, surely you can't tell me that you know what death is. Or you can misuse it like, well, then you can't know what consciousness is. Nobody knows what consciousness is. Or you could say that X, fill in the blank, X cannot be known, whatever it is, X cannot be known. These are all misuses of not knowing. You can also misuse it within the political sphere. You could say, oh, well, Leo talks about not knowing. So Leo, you've been an advocate for vaccines, these COVID vaccines. Leo, but aren't you a hypocrite, Leo? Because you don't really know if these COVID vaccines are safe. How do you know? But you're conflating absolute and relative considerations here, right? Like when it comes to survival issues, when it comes to a deadly virus that's moving through the population rapidly, you don't have time to gather all the data. You're never going to have absolute perfect knowledge of some new virus. And yet you still have to act. You still have to protect people. Otherwise, millions of people could die. So given the imperfect information, all else being equal, balancing all the probabilities and all that, you come down, you make a decision that, you're going to go get a vaccine because it seems reasonably safe. Even though you don't know. That's right. Because again, if you act with strict adherence to not knowing, you're actually going to die very quickly. That's why humans are so addicted to knowledge, because knowledge serves survival, even though a lot of times it isn't true. Also, this not knowing can be abused by others. It can be weaponized against you. For example, you might enter a state of not knowing in the realm of politics. And then, somebody like Steve Bannon comes along and his strategy is flood the zone with shit, literal quote from him, flood the zone with shit. So when you have bad actors coming into the epistemic ecosystem, information ecology, and start to pollute it with just ridiculous conspiracy theories and misinformation and just pure bullshit, and then you're just sitting there and you're just kind of equivocating, you're like, well, who's right? The Democrats are right or the Republicans are right? I don't know. It's all up for grabs. Like, it's all equal. They're all equally full of shit. No, they're not all equally full of shit. There are some bad actors who are deliberately pumping out shit, and then there's others who are being fairly honest and truthful, within the limits of a politician. And so a great mistake would be to use this idea of not knowing to put foolishness and wisdom on the same footing. It's like, Leo, why should I even listen to your, principles of wisdom? What's wrong with being a fool? After all, Leo, do I know whether it's better to be wise or to be a fool? What if being a fool is better than being, you can kind of like take it to this extreme. And when you do, this is the definition of foolishness, you will become a fool, and then you will quickly discover, life will quickly teach you, survival will very quickly teach you by punishing you mercilessly for being a fool. So do not put foolishness on the same footing as wisdom. Do not put inexperience on the same footing as experience. It's like, Leo, I don't know. We've got this giant country to run. It's a giant bureaucracy. And, I don't know. Should we elect someone who's very experienced with managing complex systems and has a lot of experience with government and all that? Or should we just get someone who's completely inexperienced, just like a shot in the dark? Let's just roll the fucking dice. And someone completely who has no experience whatsoever. I don't know, Leah, I don't know. So I'm just going to go vote for, the inexperienced one. What does it matter? This is idiocy. So make sure that you don't turn not knowing into idiocy. Not knowing does not mean that you have to abide bullshit, foolishness, ideology, propaganda, false equivalency, conspiracy theories, and various kinds of bad actors who are gaslighting you. Remember, this is all in the domain of survival, and in the domain of survival, there are jackals and wolves who will fucking rape you. So please don't go practicing not knowing when you're like, you're walking down a dark alley where you could get raped, and your intuition tells you, I shouldn't be walking alone in this dark alley. I might get raped. And then you're like, but Leo told me that I don't know. So, I don't know. So yeah, hey, walking down this dark alley might be just peachy, so I'll just do it. And then you get raped. And then you blame Leo. It's like, no, don't be an idiot, right? Start with practicing your not knowing in more safer locations and in more safer contexts. And then you can broaden it out. And as you get the handle for it, you can try it in more dangerous contexts. But remember, your ass is always on the line. So keep one eye on God and one eye on God, one eye on truth, and one eye on survival. Don't take all your eyes off of survival because you'll get fucked. Also, not knowing does not mean you don't pursue education, reading books, going to school, contemplation, journaling, insight, wisdom, consuming high-quality podcasts and videos. You should still do those things. Because see, the ego mind will be like, oh, well, not knowing, that means, hey, great, I don't got to read a book ever again in my life, right? Because books are full of knowing, and Leo told me to do not knowing. And so instead of reading a high-quality book, what do you do instead? It's not like you're just going to sit there and meditate. No, what you're going to do is you're going to go on fucking TikTok and watch stupid dancing videos. Or even worse, you're going to log into Facebook and read some stupid political memes that are going to brainwash you with Steve Bannon's, flood the zone with bullshit or Russian propaganda. Like, remember, when you're not taking action, by default, society is programming you with its bullshit. Your friends, your family, all of that, when you decide to not go work towards your career of becoming a great musician, what's going to happen? Are you just going to sit there doing nothing? No, you're going to get bored and you are going to turn on Netflix and you're going to go to the porn and you're going to get addicted to jerking off. And then you're going to go hang out with your friends. And then they're going to give you some cocaine. And then you're going to start snorting fucking cocaine because, again, you're bored and you got no purpose. You got nothing to do. And you're feeling suicidal. So you know what? Why not? Right? That's the only thing that's going to motivate you to get out of bed in the morning at some point is just the cocaine. Or the alcohol. That's why you got to maintain your healthy habits. And when you're not maintaining your healthy food habits, what are you going to be eating? You're going to be eating shit. Your friends are going to order a pizza and then you're going to pig out on it. Why? Because you got nothing, no reason to do anything else. So don't let this derail your whole life and your whole self-actualization, life purpose, hero's journey. The hero's journey, don't doubt that too much, right? Recognize that there are parts of your life where you can apply skepticism and not knowing and deconstruction more than other parts. Some parts deserve a lot more deconstructing the other parts. Before you go deconstructing something like your life purpose or your family or your career or your lover or your healthy eating habits, first, how about you deconstruct all the bullshit in your life, all the bad stuff? That's obviously bad. Not knowing isn't an option when you're in a survival situation. Survival holds a gun to your head and it says, act or die. And so there's an intense pressure to know when there's a gun to your head. And it's this pressure, it's only when you really experience this pressure and kind of you start to appreciate it that you realize like, oh, now I understand why mankind is so addicted to knowing and why not knowing is so unpopular and so kind of like taboo and little practiced. It's because most people are walking around every day. They're waking up with a gun to their head. That's most people's lives. They're waking up with a metaphorical gun to their head. They got to get the kids to the doctor, get the kids to school, quickly get to work, please their boss, pay the electric bill, pay their car bill, pay the mortgage, pay the taxes, do this and then do that every day. And there's a gun to your head. And as soon as you don't do it, click, it goes off. And so they don't even have the space or the luxury to practice some not knowing. That's the tragedy of this. Another paradox here is that even though you don't know what anything is, you can still get very good at predicting reality through massive exposure to repetitive experience. You can still develop very technical knowledge. You can still become very intuitive and wise, despite the fact that you don't know what a fork is. Like, you don't need to know what a fork is to be able to use the fork. And so don't let the not knowing of what a fork is at the first order level interfere with your masterful use of the fork, to eat the healthy food you got to eat. Because you could be like, well, Leo, I don't know what a fork is. And you're so lost in that you forget to actually use the fork to, put like some healthy food into your mouth. And instead you just shovel fistfuls of pizza and pretzels and, beer into your mouth. That would be a mistake. You might ask the question, but Leo, if not knowing is the case, how come you seem to know so much? Well, it's a very good question. I wrestle with that myself. I'll have an episode in the future about the evolution of my teachings coming soon, where I'll get a little bit more into that. For now, I'll just say that the deeper I go into not knowing, the more I question things I've taught in the past. And it's not that those things are wrong per se. It's just that I see the partiality of them. I become highly construct aware. I become very aware of how the things I know are constructed by my own mind, that they're partial, they're relative, only valid within certain contexts. And I'll be talking more about relativity as well in the future. So I just noticed so many constraints and limitations. Like everything that I say, if I had the time and you had the time to listen, I would overqualify every statement that I made. But a lot of times I don't have the time to do that. It's exhausting to do that all the time. And so, honestly, and again, a lot of the things that I try to teach, I try to make practical. And so a lot of times I'm teaching something just kind of on a practical level, not on a metaphysical level. And in that sense, it just works. If I'm giving you dating advice, for example, when I give dating advice, I don't get all metaphysical and kind of spiritual about it. It's like my dating advice, you could even say it's like very crude. Yeah, because within the domain of dating, you don't need to get too fancy for most people. I mean, you can if you want to get like very sophisticated with it, but most people, what they need is just like very basic like advice. You don't need to get all fancy to talk to a girl. You got to do some basic stuff like approach, say a few things, don't say certain other things, and you'll get decent results. You don't need to get all philosophical with it. So a lot of my advice is just like that. A lot of my knowledge is just kind of like it's practical wisdom. And you can have all sorts of insights, minor insights about reality, which is useful and practical, but still, only operative within a certain context. Still relative, still partial, still perspectival, and so forth. And honestly, I'm getting to the point where one day I might just like, literally like, I'm like, sort of like refactoring and wiping the slate clean a lot of my own, with a lot of my own models and worldviews. Like I'm trying to like deconstruct a lot of stuff in my own mind. And it's challenging to do that while simultaneously doing something constructive intellectually, through this work. So I'm trying to like balance that out. Yeah, but ultimately, like if you really press me and back me into a corner, like ultimately, like what do I really know? Ultimately, like what I know is that reality is infinity. That's what I ultimately know, is infinity. And then everything else is like the details of infinity. How does infinity unfold? There, I can be fallible. As far as the details of infinity, those are endless. And you can easily get those wrong. And that's kind of where science comes in. And science is often wrong. But like, the one thing I know is infinity. And that's what not knowing will take you towards, is infinity. And then everything else will be contingent knowledge. And self-deception is still going to be operative, all that stuff I've talked about in the past. The next question you might be wondering is like, but Leo, how can I act and create a good life while not knowing? How will I know which are the right choices and moves? It's a good question. There's something very powerful about intuition and listening to your heart, following your heart. And it's not at that point so much about knowing as it is about almost feeling. We could put it like this, that your spirit or your soul has a love for various aspects of infinity. And really your job is to honor that and to follow it, like almost like a metal detector. Those guys at the beach walking around sweeping with metal detectors, like beep, 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 when they get closer to a piece of metal, some treasure buried in the sand, it beeps, beep, 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 real fast. So you kind of have this kind of compass in your heart. Your spirit is attracted to certain things in life. You also have, what they classically call a conscience. Like you can kind of just like through gut feel, you can distinguish between, what's right and wrong. Like, it's wrong to kill people. It's wrong to steal from people. It's wrong to, to kick a puppy or to stab a baby. You got that. Hopefully if you're not like a psychopath, most people have that kind of intuition and conscience. And it's like, it's a spirit, it's got a spiritual quality to it. So, you follow your heart, you follow your kind of like gut instincts. You get good at that, at building up your intuition. I have an episode called Developing Your Intuition. Go check that out. And then again, your intuition is not perfect. You can still deceive yourself with your intuition. It's not always right. You'll still make mistakes, but it's basically the best tool you got. And so you just kind of follow that and follow that. Trust it. Now you might say, well, how do I know I can trust it, Leo? I don't know if I can trust it. Well, in that case, you're stuck. Okay, fine. So then sit there and not know anything and then just die. Do nothing. Don't even eat because you don't even know whether you should eat. Don't even shit because you don't even know if you should shit. Don't do anything and just don't even breathe because you don't even know if you should breathe. And then just die. Okay, fine. If you want to, if you want to gamble on that option, then do that. I mean, it's your life. Live however you want. You're going to have to, life is going to force you to make imperfect choices. You're going to have to make guesses, trial and error, try stuff out and see what doesn't work. And in the end, suffering will quickly teach you what's not working. So how do you create a good life? If you think smoking a bunch of weed every day, watching 10 hours of Netflix, and then playing a bunch of video games and jerking off and eating pizza and drinking beer and doing cocaine, if you think that that's going to create a good life, and you're like, well, Leo, that, in my mind, I don't know, that might be as good as like working hard and meditating and drinking celery juice. I don't know. So I'm just going to go with that. Okay, go with it, and let's see how you feel in a few months. Your feelings will quickly tell you that it's not a good life. And you might say, well, Leo, how do I know I can trust my feelings? Well, okay, fine. Then you won't mind when you're depressed and suicidal and in pain and in torture and all that. Then you won't mind, right? Because hey, how do you know that your feelings of depression, all that? How do you know that's a problem? How do you know your suffering is a problem? Why not just suffer? Suffer your whole life. You see where this goes? This kind of nihilism. So in the end, you're going to have to make some choices. And you'll quickly learn that the principles that I talk about and the wisdom that I talk about, that these are the principles that create for a good life, generally speaking. There's some exceptions around the edges. All right, so let's talk about how to apply all this. How to apply not knowing. First of all, contemplate a lot the limits of knowing. Think about what knowing is, how it's possible, where it comes from, how do you know anything at all, what do you know, what don't you know. Contemplate these things. This is Epistemology 101. And by the way, I have a lot of epistemology episodes you can go check out. Number 2, question everything that is known. Like really question deeply. Get good at questioning. And in fact, I have an episode called, I have multiple episodes about contemplation, how to contemplate, how to ask questions, how to ask powerful questions. Another episode. It's a really good one. You should revisit. Question everything. Number 3, notice that you don't know the being of anything, the being. Keep reminding yourself of that like over and over and over again. Number 4, work towards entering deep states of not knowing, like we did in that first exercise. Keep doing that. It's not enough to do it once or twice. Do that hundreds of times. Next, make use of psychedelics to enter profound states of not knowing. This is going to change your whole life if you do this. Huge. But if you're going to be using psychedelics, make sure you use them carefully and responsibly. Make sure you're not too young or too immature. Make sure you don't have mental illness and you're not on medications and so forth. So follow all my guidelines for safe tripping procedures. I have whole episodes on that. Next, don't let others and society pressure you into having to know. Like a lot of times you might be at work, your boss might be pressuring you like to predict what the next ad campaign is going to be, what the results are going to be, what the profits are going to be. And people will be pressuring you to deliver the facts, the knowledge, but the truth is that you don't know and nobody else knows. So just like you have to admit, have the backbone to say, you know what, guys, I don't know. Your boss might ask you, is this going to work? And usually you'd be kind of like, you just kind of lie and say, yeah. And here you just say, I don't know. That's the truth. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to be successful. That takes courage to say that because they'll push back on you and say, well, you should know. How dare you say you don't know? That's unacceptable. Society will treat your not knowing as though it's unacceptable to not know because they need you to know. But just because they need you to know doesn't mean that's the right thing to do. So build up that backbone to say, I don't know. Even in school, your teacher asks you some question that you're supposed to know the answer to. And the teacher will kind of judge you for like not knowing, like, what year did, World War II start in? And the teacher, needs a specific date. And you're like, well, I don't know. So So what? I don't know. So what? What are you going to do? Kill me? I don't know. So just bite that bullet. Get more comfortable not knowing and basking in mystery. Appreciate the mystery until that mystery turns into a mystical experience. Also, just literally practice saying, I don't know a lot. Practice saying it. You know, people around you, your friends, your family, and coworkers, they'll ask you about your opinion about this and about politics and about abortion and about the economy and about what happened there and about history and about the future and this. And it's like there's this temptation to start to gossip or to invent theories or to speculate, to do armchair philosophy, when really the truth is like, I don't know. Who's going to be president in 2020 or 2024? I don't know. Is Joe Biden still going to be alive in 2024? I don't know. Like, is Trump going to be alive? I don't know. Is he going to be president? I don't know. I mean, that's the truth, right? Rather than inventing like stupid stories and then justifying them. It's like, well, I think it's going to be Trump because of this and this and this. It's like, yeah, but you don't know that. You're just making shit up, right? Save the time, save the drama, and just admit you don't know. You can end a lot of debates and silly, stupid discussions online just by saying, I don't know. And by the way, I'll be doing that more as well. That's something I got to work on for myself. Also, contemplate, what do I know for sure? Also, remember to distinguish between belief and speculation on the one hand versus direct experience on the other hand. Distinguish between these things. If it's just belief and speculation, then call that I don't know. If it's direct experience, then maybe you can claim you know that. Periodically wipe the slate clean with your worldview. Just like one day, just try to take your whole worldview and just like throw it all in the trash and just try to build a new one from scratch, for example. Or better yet, just leave it blank. The other way you practice all this is remember to balance out the not knowing with action. Still take action. Be active in your life and carry on with your not knowing. And lastly, operate with deep intuition and implicit understanding. Enter the not knowing mode. Try entering it, that exercise we did at the beginning. Try entering that mode before you begin meditation, before you begin a serious bout of contemplation, before you take a psychedelic, before you do a brainstorming session or you're getting all creative with your art, before entering a discussion or communicating with another person, when listening to something controversial. First, enter a state of not knowing, and then come from that place. You'll see you'll get much better results in all these domains, and experiment with other domains you could apply it in. You know, like, let's say you're having a conflict with your spouse. You two are arguing about something, you know, she's accusing you of something, you're accusing her of something. Rather than just doing it the way that it's usually done, try this. First, take a few minutes and enter a state of deep not knowing. And then listen to her. And you'll notice things go very differently. Because to truly have a communication and not just sort of a back and forth accusation session where each side is trying to play the bigger victim, instead of that, like actually sit there with not knowing and listen to her grievances or her criticisms, really not know. And don't be like, when you don't know, then you're not going to be defensive so much because it's like, well, maybe I did do something wrong, right? You're going to be more open. You're going to be open to the idea that you did do something wrong. And then a communication could actually happen. And then if you train her to also with you get into this state and you both of you two get into a state of not knowing, that's when you can really have a high quality communication. We'll be talking more about conscious communication later in a separate episode. If you're listening to something like a controversial perspective that's different than yours, which I hope you're doing, like, for example, if you're a progressive and you're listening to some conservative talk show or something, when you listen, before you listen to it, first enter a state of complete not knowing and then listen. And vice versa. If you're a conservative and you're going to be listening to some progressive, which I hope you're doing just to challenge yourself, listen to it from a state of not knowing. You'll see that you listen in a very different way. If you're listening to some intellectual speaking, and let's say you don't fully agree with this intellectual, like let's say you're listening to Jordan Peterson or Sam Harris or somebody like that, listen to them with a state of not knowing. But also remember, that doesn't mean you're just going to be some gullible idiot that accepts everything that is said from this state of not knowing. Just because they say something doesn't mean you have to then latch onto it like a pit bull and turn it into a dogma. You can carry on with your not knowing while considering their perspective. And hell, you can do that with me too. You can also apply not knowing it at a very mundane level. So like, let's say in your business, you're going to be running some ad campaign on Facebook. Usually you would like have all these expectations and ideas about how it's going to go and what's going to happen. It's like, you can just say, wait a minute, what's the truth here? I don't know. And then run your ad campaign from a place of I don't know. Let's say, for example, you're setting up a date with a girl. You're texting her to show up on Sunday night at this place. And it's like, you don't like, does she like me? Is she going to show up? Are we going to have sex together? What shirt should I wear? What's she going to wear? Is she going to drive? Am I going to drive? Like all this like back and forth. And then you're over planning and over projecting and worrying and all this sort of stuff. Where you could instead just like come at it from a place of I don't know. Like, is she going to show up? I don't know. Are we going to have sex? I don't know. Are we going to get along? I don't know. Am I going to end up marrying this girl? I don't know. Let's just see. Let's see where it goes. For example, with investing. A lot of times you get yourself into trouble with investing because with investing, usually when you invest in something, you build up a fantasy about how much money it's going to earn you. And a lot of times those fantasies end up just being bullshit and bubbles of various kinds. So, before you invest in something like crypto or whatever, really ask yourself, do I know? Is Bitcoin going to be $100,000 per coin? Do I know? Oh, I don't know. Oh, well, yeah, of course I don't know. Is Bitcoin going to go to zero? I don't know. Maybe it will. Well, okay. Now that kind of like modulates and moderates your kind of crazy expectations with investing. Maybe you're having a confrontation with somebody at work, and usually you would kind of like project negative intentions to that person. Like you say, oh, well, that person, she's just jealous of me because I'm doing a better job than her, and she's probably scheming with that guy over there to maybe demote me at my work, and they're going to conspire, they're going to go tattle to the manager and say some bad thing about me because they're it's like that, right? But then you can ask yourself, like, do I really know that person's intentions, their motivations? Are they really out to get me? Or maybe they're just having a bad life, like personal life. Maybe they just got divorced or something. And then you go into not knowing and you realize like, oh, I don't know. Is it personal against me? Is it something, is she off her medications? Is there problems at work? Is there maybe something I could say that would fix the situation? Maybe we can have a communication. The not knowing opens up more possibilities. Or, for example, you might wonder, will there be an Actualized.org video next week? And the answer is, I don't know. We'll see. See, and as you do this, you become more comfortable not knowing. So part of this is just like accustoming yourself to living from uncertainty. Remember, your mind is addicted to certainty. But the truth is that reality in life is very uncertain. It's chaotic. Random things happen all the time. We don't know what the economy is going to do next year. We don't know what the stock market's going to do. We don't know what the housing market's going to do. We don't know what's going to happen in politics. We don't know the direction of the country. We don't know what kind of viruses will arise, new viruses. We don't know if there's going to be an oil shortage or, all sorts of stuff. That's okay. That's just the reality of life. It's no use coming up with all sorts of stories to just soothe yourself. It's the market's probably going to be okay, and this thing will do this, and this will do that, and I expect this here, and it's but these are fantasies. Why? Why do you need this? Become strong enough that you can countenance this uncertainty. So as you practice this not knowing, it will create a profound respect within you for the problem of knowing reality. This is an existential problem. It's really a metaphysical problem, not just an epistemic one. Your commitment here shouldn't be to knowing. It should be to truth. And then if you can get some knowing alongside the truth, fine. And if you can't, if the truth is that you can't know, then that's what's true. Go with that. Don't forget that in most cases, the truth is that you simply don't know. So really your default fallback position, if somebody asks you something, is I don't know. And then only if you're really certain about something and you got a lot of experience with it should you say, maybe I know something. But otherwise, you should mostly just say, I don't know. Fall back on that. It's counterintuitive that you can actually operate better from a place of not knowing because you have less fantasies in the way, less expectations, less assumptions. By acknowledging not knowing, you put yourself in the now, and it primes you with a sort of improvisational attitude. Especially if you're having a conversation with people, if you're a guy chatting up a girl at a bar or a club, you would think the best thing is for me to pre-plan a script of everything I'm going to say, then everything she's going to say, and everything I'm going to reply with. And if I just memorize that whole script, then I'm going to, that's going to be my best chance to ace that conversation. But that's actually not true because the conversation is so free-flowing, chaotic, and complex and has so many different branching paths that are possible that you can't possibly memorize all that and do it authentically and smoothly. So actually, your best bet when you're walking up to talk to a girl at a loud nightclub is don't plan anything at all. Literally, if I was doing that, I would just shut off my mind completely because my mind is usually on. If I'm walking up to a girl, I just shut off my mind completely, walk up and just start talking, just start yapping and let this is improvisation. It's an improvisational attitude. And at first it's very awkward and you don't know what to say, but as you practice it more, you get more comfortable with it and you're able to kind of dance and tango, poetically speaking, not physically. I mean, you're able to kind of tango conversationally with another person without planning anything. And your conversations go a lot better than if you were to script them all out because you're actually more true to the situation. In that situation, neither party knows what they're going to say. Anything could be said, and so you got to just be prepared for that. And now extrapolate that to the larger domain of life. It's you're going to be most effective in life when you're operating from consciousness, presence, and a responsiveness in real time. I know I've struggled with this a lot in my life. Is a lot of the ways in my life that I try to make myself feel secure, which is also what the ego is always craving for, is security. I would make myself feel secure by pre-planning everything in my life so that I had contingencies and backup plans. And if they did this, I'd do this. And if this happened, I would do this and this. And it's this. And it's just it's a very heavy-handed way to live. It's stressful and it takes the joy out of life because really the joy is being in the present moment, flowing, being responsive. That's the kind of attitude you want to develop and start practicing that. It's going to take you some years to transition away from your old kind of scripted ways of managing life and being secure in life. to get to the ultimate level, where the ultimate level is you're so conscious and awake and experienced enough to be improvisational. You're also very intuitive and kind of like wise. You're operating on certain very abstract principles that they allow you to deal with a lot of chaos and complexity in a graceful manner, even though you hadn't pre-planned any of it. And then life becomes really fun, and then you're in the flow. And not knowing can help you with that. All right, that's it. I'm done here. Please check out my website, check out my blog, check out the Actualized Clips channel, check out my book reviews list, check out my life purpose course, contribute on Patreon if you would. And the last thing I'll say is this. Remember to admit to yourself when you're listening to these advanced teachings of mine and some of the radical claims that I make about God or whatever else, spirituality, love, etc., that you don't know that these things I teach are true. This is a safety mechanism from having these turn into dogma, right? All the stuff I talk about, you have to test out for yourself to see how true it is for you. And some of the stuff I say may not be true for you because we're different people. We have different personalities, different genetics, different life circumstances, different contexts, we're different ages. So I might say something is true and it won't be true for you until you reach age 30. And right now you're age 20. That kind of stuff. I might say something that's true for a man, but it's not true for a woman. I might say something that's true for somebody in America, but it's not true for somebody in Africa. These kinds of things, like it's hard for me to consider all the contingencies, all the contexts for all the people that are living all around the world at all the different ages and have all the different mental conditions and disorders. There's a variety of different mental disorders people have, different genetics. It's a lot, it's really hard to put out a set of teachings that applies to everybody at all times in their life, for all genders, in all countries, in all circumstances. There's very few things that could be said that would be useful that are just so broad and so universal. There are some things that could be said, but generally advice is most helpful when it's very specific. But the more specific it is, the more context limited it is, right? It only applies to certain people in certain contexts, like it's very narrow. And then the more you universalize it, the more the advice just becomes like a platitude, like I could tell you something like, the golden rule of like, treat others the way you would want to be treated, something so generic. That would apply to probably everybody on earth for the most part, but it's like, does that really help you? Not so much. So the bottom line is, the most advanced things that I teach, you don't know. For example, is solipsism true? For most of you, the answer is you don't know. And that's the truth for you right now. So go with that. So rather than sitting in your room alone, it's like, oh my God, Leo was talking about solipsism sometime ago. It must be true. And that means like, oh, my parents are imaginary and Leo's imaginary, all this is imaginary. And it's like, oh my God, now I'm depressed. But it's not your truth. You see, something that's my truth is not your truth until you directly become conscious of it. So be very careful with that. Go with your truth, but also be open to the possibility that your truth is just like a partial, limited truth, and there's higher truths that I might be talking about that you haven't reached yet. And so you'll be aiming towards those. But don't live as though you've already got that as a truth, right? Don't go living as though, like, for example, I might say that death isn't real. I've said that before. Death is imaginary. Okay, that's my truth. I'm conscious of that. Most of you are not conscious of that, so don't go living as though that's true for you. Because the reality is, like, you might be terrified of death, Or you might have no idea, how's it possible that death can be mad? What? That sounds ridiculous. Well, if it sounds ridiculous to you, then obviously it's not your truth. But also be open to the possibility that even though it sounds ridiculous to you right now, there might be something you're overlooking, something you're missing, something will get recontextualized as you do the work, and then it will become your truth. So stay open, but also stay true to what's true for you. And stick around for more.